morning and welcome to London Assembly's first Mayor's Question Time after our annual general meeting last week. If we can start with item number 1, which is Chair's announcement and apologies for absence. To begin with, our crucial task as the members of London Assembly is to hold the Mayor of London publicly and democratically accountable. Through this forum, we examine the Mayor's policies, decisions, actions, and raise issues that matter to London and Londoners. Members and Mr. Mayor, I seek your utmost cooperation so as to maintain this meeting a powerful instrument in discharging our duties as elected members. I thank Mr. Mayor for your promise to be upfront and clear, and I look forward to a constructive and healthy dialogue with all concerned. May I request you, please, do not talk over each other to make life easier for everyone, and also I'll do the same to help our flow of the debate and clarity of points being made today. So let's get on with the business. Can I ask the clerk, Rebecca Arnold, to confirm the names of the Assembly members who are virtually present at this meeting, and any apologies for absence, please?
Good morning, Chair. Present in the meeting, we have Assemblymember Arnold, Assemblymember Bacon, Assemblymember Bailey, Assemblymember Berry, Assemblymember Boff, Assemblymember Cooper, Assemblymember Desai, Assemblymember Devonish, Assemblymember Dismore, Assemblymember Duval, Assemblymember Eshalomi, Assemblymember Gavron, Assemblymember Hall, Assemblymember Curtin, Assemblymember McCartney, Assemblymember Moore, Assemblymember O'Connell, Assemblymember Pigeon, Assemblymember Prince, Assemblymember Qureshi, Assemblymember Russell, Assemblymember Dr. Sahota, Assemblymember Whittle, and yourself, Assemblymember Shah, the Chair. We have no apologies for absence, and I believe we are expecting the Deputy Chairman, Assemblymember Arbour, shortly. And we also have the Mayor with us.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, and welcome to this meeting again. In terms of announcements from the Chair, can I now provide an update on recent Assembly activities? The Assembly held its annual meeting last Friday, where a new chair, which is myself, Deputy Chair, Assembly Member Arbour, and committee chairs were elected. The GLA Oversight Committee held a meeting in early May to understand how London is responding to COVID-19. The Health Committee published a letter to the Mayor of London urgently addressing London's health inequalities, especially in the light of COVID-19 pandemic. And last item, yesterday, the GLA Oversight Committee met with the Minister for London, Paul Scully, MP, on COVID-19 and discussed how the government is working with the Mayor and other stakeholders during this time. If we can move on to item number 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask the Assembly to note the recommendations as set out in item 2? Can we agree?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Can I also ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests or other relevant interests where they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? Are there any more to add? Nope.
No.
Thank you very much. We now move on to item number 3, which is Mayor's report. Can I ask Assembly formally to receive the Mayor's report covering the period from 6th March 20 to 7th May 2020. The Mayor will now provide an oral update of up to 5 minutes on matters occurring since the publication of his report. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just check I'm not on mute?
No, you're not.
No, you're okay.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start by paying my respects to the many Londoners who've so far lost their lives to COVID-19. This cruel virus is the biggest health, social and economic crisis to face our city, the UK and the entire world since World War II. Although we've passed the peak of this current wave of infections here in London, it is already clear that we will be living with the consequences for many years to come. There will simply be no returning to life as it was. Since the start of this outbreak, I've tried to work as constructively as possible with the government and other public agencies on the response. I've put aside party politics, supporting ministers however possible while only highlighting government mistakes in a constructive way in order to improve the response and ultimately save lives. Through the London Strategic Coordinating Group, or SCG, I've worked hand in glove with the government, NHS, local authorities and others to lead a multi-agency response to COVID-19 in our city. I've been in almost daily contact with ministers, NHS and Public Health England officials, council leaders from all parties, the First Ministers of the devolved nations and other Metro mayors and the commissioners of the mayoral bodies to lead London's response. I know many Assembly members have received regular briefings from Dr. Fiona Twycross, John Barradell and Eleanor Kennedy, and I'd like to express my thanks on behalf of all Londoners for their service to our city. Let me be clear, Chair, lockdown has not been lifted, and maintaining social distancing as lockdown is eased is a monumental challenge that will require all of us to change our behaviour. Everyone must still stay at home as much as possible, and where you can, work from home. Everyone must avoid public transport unless absolutely necessary, and where possible, walk and cycle more. COVID-19 is the biggest challenge to face our public transport network in TfL's history, and I'm bitterly disappointed on all Londoners' behalf that the government has chosen to make us pay a very heavy price for doing the right thing on COVID-19. Because Londoners stayed at home and fare incomes accordingly reduced by 90%, the government's insisted that we increase TfL fares, widen the scope and hours of the congestion charge, temporarily suspend free travel for Freedom Pass 60 plus and under 18 pass holders, and load Londoners with huge levels of debt. We're now beginning to develop our programme of work to support London's recovery from this crisis. The government has a responsibility to ensure that no one is left permanently unemployed, homeless or pushed into poverty as a result of COVID-19. And I'll do everything in my power to see that London emerges as a fairer, greener and better city. Chair, before I end, I'm going to put on my record my thanks to Assembly Member Arnold for her role as Chair over the past year and for Deputy Chair Arbour and for Jeanette's service to our city over many years, and indeed Tony's as well. And I congratulate you, Chair, on your new appointment. I know that you will, as your predecessors have, chair these meetings in an impartial and professional manner in the year to come. Finally, Chair, ahead of Eid this weekend, I want to send my warmest wishes to everyone celebrating in London and across the world. This has been a Ramadan like no other. Fasting is hard enough as it is, believe me, but my special thanks go to the NHS, care staff and key workers who observed the long days of Ramadan whilst working on the front line in the battle against COVID-19. Chair, I've been asked for one oral update from Assembly Member Boff. So with your permission, I'll answer as a request for an oral update.
If you can, please go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The oral update is in relation to PHV partition screens. The latest advice from the Scientific and Technical Advisory Cell of the London's Strategic Coordination Group states that, and I quote, "There is no evidence available that demonstrates that partitions in taxis or PHVs reduce the risk of transmission of COVID-19 infection. Partitions in taxis or PHVs do not provide a fully sealed compartment which completely separates the driver from the passenger. Therefore, whilst it is possible that partitions may reduce the risk of transmission of infection, the risk would not be eliminated entirely," end quote. I do appreciate the unsettling nature of the coronavirus pandemic. I understand that drivers may want to install a protective screen in their private hire vehicle. However, we must bear in mind that while TfL has had approaches from a number of different operators, none are proposing a solution that provides a completely sealed compartment. It is also imperative that existing safety standards continue to be followed. TfL cannot approve protective screens that, for example, obstruct the driver's rear view and make driving more dangerous.
Can you hear me? Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry, there is a problem with broadcast, so I have to adjourn the meeting and reconvene. Sorry about this, but there's some technical hitch, so we need to sort that out. Thank you. Right. What's happened?
Are we still live?
GLA, Chamber,
sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound. GLA, chamber, sound.
The Scientific and Technical
Sorry.
Advisory Cell
We are not, Mr. Mayor,
London's
we are not live. Well, I assume we are back again on air, and sorry about the glitch, but let us start with Mr. Mayor. You were on the oral update with regards to taxi and private hire item from Assembly Buff. Can you please start from your full oral update on that issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The latest advice from the Scientific and Technical Advisory Cell of London's Strategic Coordination Group states that, and I quote, "There is no evidence available that demonstrates that partitions in taxis or PHVs reduce the risk of transmission of COVID-19 infection. Partitions in taxis or PHVs do not provide a fully sealed compartment which completely separates the driver from the passenger. Therefore, whilst it is possible that partitions may reduce the risk of transmission of infection, the risk would not be eliminated entirely." End quote. I do appreciate the unsettling nature of the coronavirus pandemic. I understand that drivers may want to install a protective screen in their private hire vehicle. However, we must bear in mind that while TfL has had approaches from a number of different operators, none are proposing a solution that provides a completely sealed compartment. It is also imperative that existing safety standards continue to be followed. TfL cannot approve protective screens that, for example, obstruct the driver's rear view and make driving more dangerous. Nor can they approve proposals where plastic screens are touching passengers, potentially putting them at risk of serious burns were there to be an incident in the vehicle involving fire. TfL are doing everything they can to move this forward at pace, but it's imperative that these screens meet appropriate safety standards. TfL have been regularly engaging with the trade, meeting them on a weekly basis throughout the pandemic, and many of London's PHV operators are developing proposals for protective screens in their fleets. Some initial options have already been discussed with TfL and feedback has been provided. To push this issue forward, TfL has published a set of criteria and has followed up with a written request to PHV operators and explained what information it would need to evaluate whether the screen in question meets appropriate safety standards. TfL will review this information when it's received. It should be remembered, though, that TfL is not assessing whether these screens provide any form of protection for drivers or passengers against the transmission of coronavirus. The assessment is about whether the screen meets appropriate safety standards. Whilst this process is underway, TfL has asked that screens not be fitted into PHVs until they're approved. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Buff, do you want to come back on what you heard?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, what you said is basically what has been published to date by TfL. But drivers want clarity, Mr. Mayor. They need to know that their efforts to reduce the risk to their customers will not at a later date be used in some way as evidence of their non-compliance with the conditions of their licence. And much as TfL may be wanting to move forward the process of approvals, does TfL have the capacity to individually authorise every single screen? I'm concerned that those efforts that the PHV drivers are going to are just not being appreciated by TfL.
Chair, can I thank the Senator for his question, and I accept the concerns of PHV drivers and it affects their livelihoods. Just to reassure Senator Boff, TfL speak regularly to the operators, so the companies that often employ who have a contract with the drivers. I know, for example, tomorrow there's another call scheduled which will go through some of the issues. And so, for example, if operator A has drivers working for them, and they will all use a screen that's been approved safe, that may fast track the process. But I can understand the concern you're expressing about all 100,000 private hire vehicles being inspected. I don't think that's the intention. That's one of the reasons why they're speaking to the big operators. And the operators have actually been working collaboratively with TfL, but some concerns have been expressed with some of the options put forward, but TfL will continue to engage. TfL wants to make it work for the operators, with the caveat, this is about the screen being safe in relation to safety, not about their effectiveness of dealing with the coronavirus being transmitted.
Thank you. Assembly Member Buff, Anything more?
Only to say, Mr. Mayor, there's no pretense that these screens are in any way completely eliminate the risk of infection. The argument is pretty similar to that with regard to face masks. Face masks do not completely eliminate the infection, and you yourself are now recommending that face masks are used on the public transport network. I just don't want to see those drivers penalised for trying to do the right thing.
It's a very fair point, Chair, well made, and I'll make sure that point's passed on to TfL and to the Deputy Mayor as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Did Assembly Member Bailey indicate he wanted to come in on Mayor's report, or shall I move on?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
Do you want to come in?
Yes, please.
All right. Thank you. Go ahead.
Good morning to you all. Good morning, Mr. Mayor. In your update, you talked about the congestion charge and its reintroduction and its increase in price, etc. But in the statement released by yourself and the government, it asked for a proposal. Did you provide a proposal for the changes you've made to the congestion charge?
We've been in close contact with the government. In fact, the agreement with the government is quite clear. The agreement is for the immediate reintroduction of the London congestion charge, LEZ and ULEZ, and urgently bring forward proposals to widen the scope and levels of these charges in accordance with the relevant legal powers. Now, these changes haven't been made, so of course, if the government aren't happy with the proposals, it's open to them to say we don't like them. So far, they've said they've not said that, which means that widening the scope and the level, as the government wants us to do, we think we've met their objective without the need for them to say we're breaching the agreement with them.
So did you announce this change, or did you actually provide them with a proposal? Because if you did, we'd like to see the proposal if possible.
We're in regular contact with the DfT, as I said in my report, on a daily basis. The key requirement for the government for us to widen the scope and level of charges, if they weren't satisfied with that, they would have said we're in breach of the agreement. And we're also required to reintroduce urgently. So the deal was concluded on Thursday at 5 p.m. By the Monday, we reintroduced the congestion charge as required by the government. And we've been speaking to the government about how we widen the scope. And like I said, it's perfectly reasonable for the Secretary of State or the Prime Minister to say, you know what, Mr. Mayor, I'm not happy with how you're proposing to widen the scope or the increase in charges. We need to go even further. Thankfully, they've not said that, which leads me to conclude they won't be asking us to widen the scope even further or to increase the charges even further, which is a relief.
Be it as it may, Mr. Mayor, for the government to come back, they would need a formal proposal. They asked for one in the original statement, and all I'm saying is, did you provide that proposal for them to respond to? Being in contact is great, and we appreciate that you have that contact, but they asked for a proposal. Was a proposal provided?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to explain this more clearly. So we're in regular contact with the Department for Transport. In fact, most recently, early this week, the Deputy Mayor was on a call with the Secretary of State and many others as part of the conversations we had. These are regular conversations, and so the DfT and the government are cognizant by the deal being concluded, what we could try and do. We said to them we would try and accede to their requirement. We have to accede to their requirement, because if we don't, they pull the grant and they pull the loan, which means us having to go into the Section 114 Local Government Finance Act provisions. And
we understand that. Sorry, because we're time pressed.
I don't think you do that.
I think it's you who misunderstand. All I'm asking is very simple. Did you provide a proposal, a formal proposal, as you were requested in the document? In the agreement you have with the government, it asks for a proposal. That's very different to having a conversation, a regular conversation like you do. If we get a response from the government, it will be around the proposal you made. Has that proposal been made? Can we see the document?
Well, it's not, these things don't happen by documents. They're in conversation all the time. The meetings take place all the time. And so the government are aware of how we're trying to meet their requirement to widen the scope and the level of congestion charge. If the government aren't happy, if they think we've not gone far enough, they can come back to us and say, go further, and we'll have a discussion.
We'll have to agree to disagree. For the government to come back, they can't just make pronouncements in the press. It would seem like you informed everybody through the press, and that's when the government found out. I'm just asking, did you write to them formally with a proposal as requested to talk about what you plan to do? And if you did so, let's see the document. If you didn't, just let us know you didn't make a proposal. You just did an announcement.
think what this exchange shows is I think I'm closer to the government than you are with respect. And so we're in contact with the government. They required us to widen the scope and the level of congestion charge. We explained to them what we were going to do in response to their requirement. At no stage since then being made aware of how we're going to accede to their requirement have they come back to say you're not going far enough in relation to either the scope or the charges. But clearly we've not introduced the widening the scope or the charges yet. I'd encourage all Londoners to get in contact with TfL over the course of the next week to let us know what their views are. In particular, I know disabled groups and others may have views. Let us know what your views are. We're undertaking an equality impact assessment, and it's open to the government at any stage to say to us, and they've not said it so far, thankfully, we need to go even wider in scope or even higher in charges.
So you didn't provide a proposal is the answer. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member, thank
Chair,
you.
That's not the answer. I'll repeat again. We've provided the government with all the answers they've asked us to do. One of the requirements on us was to come back with how we're going to widen the scope and increase the charges. Another requirement was for us to reintroduce the congestion charge ULEZ and the LEZ urgently. We've done that. Again, they've not expressed unhappiness with that, and they've not expressed unhappiness in relation to our widening the scope or the charges. Clearly, if it's the case the government say go even higher or widen the scope even further, we'll have to revisit that. But I've announced what we hope will satisfy the government, and I hope the government don't go even further in relation to punishing Londoners.
Can we now stop the conversation there? We had the explanation and move on to the questions to the Mayor. Right. Thank you.
Chair, I had asked to come in, if you don't mind, AM Devonish.
On this subject matter.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Can you be brief, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning. Will you publish in full the TfL government bailout details today so there can be complete clarity on the discussion you just had with AM Bailey? Thank you.
I'm very happy to publish the document. It's the gift of the government. So I agreed a number of days ago, and I want it to be published. We're waiting for consent from the government. As you'll appreciate, it's a matter of courtesy not to publish a document without both sides agreeing to it. I'm very, very happy and indeed keen. And that way Londoners will see the other onerous conditions placed upon us, raising the fares by January, taking away bus passes for under 18-year-olds, putting restrictions in place for those above 60 and those freedom pass holders, indeed requiring us to urgently reinstate the congestion charge, the ULEZ and the LEZ, but also widening the scope of the congestion charge and the level of charges, as well as the requirement for us to take out a loan of more than £500 million. We're now reduce the deficit from £1.5 billion now to £200 million, with a plan to go to surplus in 2 months' time, reducing that by 71% the operating deficit and increasing cash balances by 60%.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, I don't want to, if you wouldn't mind, I don't want to take up all my time. I just simply want to make sure the document is available to Londoners to make up their own minds, and not just your view or my view, indeed. We need everybody to be able to read this document. So please go back to the government and get it agreed that you can publish that document as soon as possible. Thank you.
Well, Chair, I'll carry on using my avenues to lobby the government. If Senator Devonish could use his influence to lobby the government as well. I want transparency. I want Londoners to know how we've been published by the government. It's really important the government gives us permission to publish the document.
Thank you.
Right. I believe there isn't any more intervention. Anybody else coming in?
And then we can find out what the hell's happening. Okay? Bye.
Right. Okay. Let's move on to the questions to the Mayor. We now move the questions on the priority order paper, which you all have received. The first question, and that's question number 1590, entitled "The Future of London Transport," is in the name of our brand new Assembly Member Moore. Welcome, and please go ahead, Assembly Member Moore, with your question, please. Mr. Mayor,
Chair, shall I respond?
Can you respond, please? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. But firstly, can I also welcome Senator Member Alison Moore in her place in the Assembly, albeit virtually rather than physically in the chamber. The question is about the future of London transport. COVID-19 is the biggest challenge to London's public transport network in TfL's history. Keeping passengers and staff as safe as possible has and will continue to be our highest priority. Maintaining social distancing on the public transport network as lockdown is eased will take a monumental effort from all Londoners. We're still asking Londoners not to use public transport unless it's absolutely necessary and must be there for people who really have no other alternative. We're working with the government, employers and schools to stagger working hours throughout the day, but everyone who can work from home will have to continue to do so. If you have to use public transport, please avoid peak times and wear a non-medical face covering and walk or cycle whenever possible. We've launched the Street Space programme to urgently expand cycling and pavement space for what could be a 10-fold increase in cycling and 5-fold increase in walking. We're urging Londoners not to replace public transport journeys with car usage. This would instantly make our roads unusably congested and increase toxic pollution. The congestion charge, ULEZ and low emission have been reintroduced. There is a further review to the congestion charge as required by the government as part of the TfL funding deal. COVID-19 has also caused an unprecedented financial challenge for TfL and other transport operators in the UK and wider afield. Despite being one of the only major cities in Europe without government funding for day-to-day transport operations, we'd significantly improved TfL's financing since 2016, reducing operating deficit by 71% and increasing cash balances by 16%. However, fares income have fallen by around 90% during lockdown. We've now reached agreement with the government on a funding package to allow TfL to run public transport in London for the next 4.5 months. TfL still faces unprecedented challenges over the coming months, both operationally and financially, and I'll continue to be as clear and upfront with Londoners as possible about the consequences. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Moore, do you want to come back on any of this?
Thank you, I would. Yes, please. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for joining us during Ramadan and at this difficult time for all of us. We're all very much aware that you have the interests of Londoners very much at your heart. So my follow-up question is, last week you did agree that funding package with the government, and they said they will publish it at the first opportunity. Why do you think they've not yet published it? And do you think it's so they can continue to play fast and loose and make false claims about what you agreed to do in respect to the congestion charge?
Thank you for your question. I've been disappointed by the government's approach to this. I was unhappy with the deal, but what I didn't do is go run into the media as the government did on Thursday night, Friday morning with their briefing. By the way, they're also briefing aggressively against the Scottish government and the Welsh government, so I'm not by myself in being briefed against by the government or Conservative politicians. I think it shows bad spirit and bad faith, particularly as we've got to work collegially with them, and we do by and large work well with the government, not just the DfT. We're working closely with the RDG across the country, and you'll be pleased to know that when I compare TfL's response versus other train operating companies, we should be really proud we're ahead of the rest of the country in relation to the services we're providing, in relation to our ability to cope with this pandemic virus. What concerns me is we've been punished in a way others haven't. Others were given a grant. We've been given a grant plus required to take out this huge loan, but also others didn't have onerous conditions attached as we have. I'm disappointed in the government, and I hope they'll reflect on their behaviour and ask themselves whether this is the way to behave during a national crisis when all of us should put aside differences and work together.
Thank you. And with the national requirement to maintain 2 metres social distancing wherever possible, means that you can only carry 13 to 15% of the normal passengers, even when you're up to 100% of the service over time. Can TfL operate long-term on just 13 to 15% of normal numbers of passengers? Or do you think it will require some ongoing subsidy from central government so that TfL can provide services until we're clear of this virus?
The deal made between George Osborne and Boris Johnson in 2015 was a deal that says TfL would lose the operating grant that other transport authorities around the world receive. What that means is that more than 80% of our services are provided by a combination of fares, the congestion charge and advertising. And now what we know is over the last 8 weeks, we've lost more than 90% of our passengers. Even yesterday, only 8% of passengers were using the tube. We've lost 92%. And it's simply not possible for us to provide the services we do without the customers that we used to have. With a 90% cut, we can't do so. We need £600 million a month to provide our services. Even though we've reduced the operating deficit, even though we've increased the cash balances, we need one of two things from the government. Either a continuing operating grant from the government to carry us forward whilst we have the consequences of the virus, or devolving to London the powers to raise taxes, whether it's by property taxes, stamp duty, council tax, business rates, land value capture, the sort of stuff talked about in the London Finance Commission report commissioned by one Boris Johnson. Without one of those two things, or a combination of both, it won't be possible for us to run the services. And this is a sticking plaster deal, which is why it's really important the government works with us for the best interest of London, which is the best interest of our country.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I think I will leave that there in a minute, Chair. It's disheartening to see the government playing politics with people's lives and punishing Londoners. But thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Can I ask Assembly Member Dismore if he wants supplementary on this?
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mayor, you've made clear that you think people on the public transport network should wear face coverings. You asked the government to make this compulsory, which they've refused to do. Have you considered using your powers to make it a condition of carriage to require face coverings? Because such a rule could be made pretty quickly, in the same way that smoking was banned after the King's Cross fire, more recently the ban on alcohol consumption. I would suggest that enforcement would be as much by peer pressure of other passengers as anything else, and such peer pressure would be strengthened if it was a legal requirement to wear face masks. Can I thank Chair Senator for his question? So I first started lobbying the government to change their guidance on non-medical facial coverings back in early April, because I saw what's happening around the world from speaking to colleagues. And just to remind colleagues, a non-medical facial covering doesn't protect the wearer. What it does is it protects others, because if you're pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic, it stops you passing on the virus. Finally, 10 days ago, the Prime Minister agreed to change the advice in relation to the wearing of non-medical facial coverings where you can't keep your social distance, public transport and shops being two examples. We are reviewing what's happening in London in relation to voluntary wearing of non-medical facial coverings. Next week, I'll be considering whether I need to use the option I've got to make it mandatory. I'm hoping that we can work collegially with the DfT and the government to reach a sensible compromise, because you'll be aware that there are some services in London that aren't under my control, particularly the Network Rail services, and we don't want confusion. When there is a crisis, what's important is to have message clarity. And so what I want is a consensus around this issue. I've been speaking to colleagues in Scotland, Wales and across the country, and I'll continue to try and lobby the government on this one. We've been successful in other issues. I'm hoping to be successful here, but I leave the option available, which is to make it mandatory in London only. But I'm hoping we can persuade the government to do the right thing. Okay, thank you.
All right, Mr. Mayor, there's a change, slight change in priority order as against what we have on the agenda. Can I bring in Assembly Member Pigeon to put her question number 1465, which is about COVID-19 and safe travel? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. And my question follows on from Assembly Member Moore's. Mr. Mayor, I recognise that measures are being taken by TfL to ensure the risk of spreading COVID-19 are reduced. And I wish to pay tribute to TfL staff and bus drivers who are doing such an important job in such challenging circumstances. But I do think there are important further measures that must be taken to protect the public and staff, and managing and spreading demand on the transport network is key. So I'm wondering, have you considered introducing perhaps flexible fares to encourage people starting earlier in the morning, such as half-price travel before 7:30, to ensure the morning peak is spread out more?
Well, Chair, firstly, can I just put on record, not just my thanks to the staff, but Senator Pigeon's public message has been really supportive. And that message clarity has been really, really helpful. And I'm really grateful. I really am. We were exploring a number of these issues, but I've got one hand tied behind my back because of the requirements from government in relation to the options available to me on a number of issues. But we are looking at the very issue she's raised about how we can massage the people using public transport to give a to give a carrot, not now, because now we're still in lockdown. I'm quite clear. We are still in lockdown. You should really be at home unless you've got a very good reason not to be at home. But you're right to ask me to explore what we do once lockdown's been lifted. So can I reassure you that work's been undertaken now. So we, as ready as we can be, should we in the future move to a phase where there's more of an easing of lockdown, and we get to a stage where we are encouraging people outside of the rush hours to use public transport. And she'll be aware as an expert, 5:45 to 8:30 at difficult times, and about 4 to 5:30 at difficult times. And the other complication is if schools start returning as well. But we are exploring that. And I'm happy to have Deputy Mayor Alexander speak to Caroline Pigeon about some of the things, because I know she takes keen interest in this.
Lovely, thank you very much. And there are also peaks in demand on certain sections of the tube network. Are you considering introducing additional express buses to ensure people can avoid perhaps the tube in certain places and to help, with social distancing?
A problem at the moment is having the resources to provide additional services. You'll be aware of the deal the government struck with us, which is just to keep us going for 4.5 months end of September. I'm not sure there's any flex there to provide more services with the money we've got. I think the money we've got is just to provide the services we were providing before the pandemic crisis. But if there's an opportunity, of course, we'll explore that. We are, by the way, using BTP, our staff and stewards to try and signpost people away, but also she'll be reassured to know we're speaking to the TOCs and the buses to make sure there isn't decanting at the same time at certain pinch points.
That's good to hear. I think express buses, even converting some existing routes, has potential, but also there's an issue where you could potentially increase bus capacity by using tourist buses. They're currently sitting unused, and of course they have an open top deck, which I'm sure would fresh air on the top deck and would help with social distancing. Is that something you're also considering?
No, we haven't yet, because there's been a cost in hiring those buses. To give you an idea of the challenge, though, a normal bus takes double-decker bus takes 85 passengers. We're talking about 15, 16 being a safe number. That gives you an idea of what reducing capacity to social distancing measures mean. I'm not sure we've got the budget to hire these tourist buses, but we are exploring what we can do to increase capacity on public transport. But to avoid any confusion, the advice at the moment is to stay at home. We are still in lockdown. I don't want anybody to think they should go about using public transport. They really shouldn't unless they have to if they're an essential worker.
Thank you. And obviously you're already telling people to avoid certain key stations. But the issue of serious air pollution in some London Underground stations, often magnified by poor ventilation and stagnant air, also needs to be looked at. A recent study by researchers at the National Institutes of Health has found particles of coronavirus released simply by talking can remain in the air for 8 to 14 minutes. There's also been a further study, though it's not been peer-reviewed yet, that shows that air pollution can help spread coronavirus through particles of pollution carrying the virus further afield. So I'm wondering what assurances you can give that every step is being taken to tackle air pollution across the underground network, and potentially whether you might take any precautionary measures to perhaps discourage the use at certain tube stations.
Thank you for the question. We actually are encouraging people now not to use public transport, not to use a tube unless you really have to. We'll just avoid certain stations, but avoid certain parts of the day. We continue to be ahead of the science. You'll be aware, Senator Pigeon, of the research we asked to undertake because of the concern raised around particulate matter in the underground, different to the particulate matter that we see in subsurface areas. We'll continue to be follow the science, but of course we follow the latest research, and if it is the case that we receive public health advice or research shows it's unsafe to do certain things, we will of course be open and transparent with Londoners. It's really important we do so.
Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you. Can we move on to the next question, which is from Assembly Member Bailey, and that is question number 1516 on TfL staff safety. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank the Assembly Member for his question? Although Assembly Member Bailey has only asked about TfL staff, with the Chair's permission, I'll answer more widely, as I've always been clear and recognised it isn't just TfL staff who run public transport in our city. It's absolutely heartbreaking that public transport workers, including TfL staff and contractors, have lost their lives to COVID-19. It's a tragic reminder that they are key workers who've gone above and beyond to help save lives. We owe them all an enormous debt of gratitude. The safety of staff and passengers has been and will continue to be our highest priority. That's why TfL has done more to keep public transport safe during this crisis than any other transport provider in the UK, as has been recognised by the trade unions who represent transport workers. Some of the actions we have taken include an enhanced cleaning regime across the entire tube, bus, tram and TfL rail network, using a new hospital-grade antiviral disinfectant that provides protection for up to 30 days, lobbying the government to allow transport workers to access the testing scheme for key workers and encouraging staff who meet the criteria to do so, making buses middle door boarding only, closing off the seats nearest drivers and putting an additional film over the protective screen on drivers' cabs, installing hundreds of hand sanitisers in stations and stops across London, funding enhanced sick pay for bus drivers and ensuring cleaners get full shift rate for pay of self-isolating, pushing the government to change its guidance on wearing non-medical face coverings on public transport to keep staff and passengers safe. When they blatantly did, we immediately asked Londoners to do so and provided all TfL staff and contractors with basic masks, doing everything possible to ensure Londoners doing everything possible to encourage Londoners not to use public transport and to socially distance at stations and stops. This includes emails, announcements, signage and foot markings in stations, as well as deploying over 100 British Transport Police and additional staff and stewards across the network to ensure the rules are followed. And I pay tribute to the transport trade unions for the constructive way they've worked with us to protect staff and passengers during a terrifying time for their members. And I repeat my thanks to all public transport workers for everything they've done and continue to do for our city.
Sorry, we can't hear you, Assembly Member Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your answer. And I'd also like to echo your thanks to transport workers working across London at this very dangerous and scary time. How long have non-medical facial coverings been available to TfL staff?
They were made available to staff as soon as the advice from the government changed. I think it was 10 days ago. But those staff who do work that requires PPE have still been using PPE. So for other staff and contractors, the basic masks were available after the Prime Minister's announcement of the change of guidance.
Why did you wait so long to provide your own staff with these facial coverings? You have full control over this. They had to wait 7 weeks, Mr. Mayor, 7 weeks. You could have taken charge of that much earlier on.
Well, as we've rehearsed in a previous answer, I'm in daily contact with the government, but also Public Health England, SAGE, and experts from the World Health Organization. Their advice and guidance is quite clear that medical PPE, surgical visors, and the like PPE should only be for those in NHS and care settings. They should not be used in other settings like transport or food and other outlets. And we've followed the advice. In the meantime, we were lobbying the government in relation to the wearing of non-medical, non-surgical medical covering. Just to remind colleagues, this does not keep the wearer safe. It keeps other people safe because it stops the virus being passed on. Once the government changed the advice, we made available to our staff and contractors these basic masks, and we continue to do so.
But surely, Mr. Mayor, your job is to make a special case for London. They're your staff. They rely on you to keep them safe. You have full control of this. Why did it take so long? Are you comfortable with the delay that you've instituted for your staff before they could get this protection?
So the measures we've introduced in London, our public transport, are the most comprehensive of any transport authority in the country. Not just the long-lasting hospital-quality antiviral disinfectant, not just the regular cleansing of buses, key touch points, the depots, the restroom, the garages, not just asking the trade unions to also help with the inspections, but also we closed off the front door, which is criticised by the government, saying passengers stay away from drivers, only using the middle doors, not allowing passengers to embark or disembark, but also put a protective film on the Perspex glass. Because I'm keen to make sure we can do as much as we can and learn in real time, I've asked TfL to commission world-leading experts, UCL, led by Sir Michael Marmot, who is undertaking an urgent review of all the steps we've taken to see whether they were the right steps at the right time, but also what more we can be doing. And they'll be providing their review, their report, in the next few weeks. We'll see what further steps need to be taken. But I'm confident that not only have we followed all the advice and best guidance, we've gone above and beyond what we've been asked to do so.
Are you comfortable with the delay that you've had, though? You've spoken a lot about the government and what they haven't done. What we're interested in, what you have done. Are you comfortable with what you have done to keep TfL staff safe? Remember, they had to wait 7 full weeks before you provided them with any kind of protection, whilst, by the way, you were asking for everybody else to wear masks. You weren't providing them for your own staff. That feels like a failure on your part to deliver for your own staff, who of course have died at a rate 5 times that of NHS workers. So it's a very serious thing for you not to deliver on this particular protection.
Well, it's important to get the facts right, particularly when it's a premise of a question. So I was lobbying the government to change their guidance in relation to the wearing of non-medical facial coverings. That guidance changed 10 days ago when the Prime Minister announced on Sunday, he announced in a Cobra meeting he was going to be doing this, and he made the announcement on Sunday, and the guidance was published on Monday. We then started providing the basic masks to not just our staff, but our contractors as well. In the meantime, we've been going above and beyond, working with hard-working trade unions to make sure all our staff and passengers are as safe as they can be. And I'm confident that we've been having regular contact, not just with staff, not just with trade unions, but also with public health experts across the country and around the world to do what we can. It's not the case that we haven't been making sure that we're providing safe public transport for passengers and staff. One of the reasons why I've asked TfL to urgently instruct UCL to do this piece of work is to make sure in real time we learn any lessons that need to be learned, not in 3 or 4 years' time when there's been an independent public inquiry that needs to be had.
Mr. Mayor, you failed to provide the protection for your staff over 7 weeks, a 7-week period. So it feels quite hard to sit here and hear you talk about real time, because in that time, the unions criticised you for not defending your staff. I asked you to do more to defend your staff, and you didn't do it. And it feels like a failure. Londoners have watched for 7 weeks while transport staff have died, and you did not provide any protection for them.
Well, the difference between you and I is I've been regularly engaging with not just the staff, but with the trade unions. And I noticed, unfortunately, you didn't give them credit in the beginning of the question as you did others. I give them credit. The trade unions have done a brilliant job representing their staff who have been scared of going to work. It's because we've been listening to the trade unions and the workers that we stopped the front door being used on our buses, and we only allowed embarking and disembarking on the middle doors. It's because we've been listening to the staff, the workers, the trade unions, that we added an additional protective film over the perspex that separates the driver from the passenger. It's because we listened to the trade unions and the staff that we stopped passengers sitting next to bus drivers, so they were a number of meters away from bus drivers. It's because we listened to the trade unions and the workers that we said to the trade unions, you provide additional inspectors to make sure that you're reassured. But it's also because we've listened to the staff and workers and trade unions, we provided our staff with hand sanitizers, alcohol wipes to make sure they were confident that the touch points were as clean as they could be. We also, in the meantime, made sure
Mr. Mayor, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Mayor, but we're time pressured, as you know, so I'm going to stop there. But you failed to deliver these things without being pressured.
Then you make a statement. You can't have both ways, Chair. Either stop there or he's going to make a statement. It's a virtual meeting. It's very difficult to be heckled virtually.
I'm not helping you.
Can you please
you
not
have to be pressured to take any action at all. You failed your own staff.
Sorry, Chair. Chair, is there a question for me, Chair? Because it's very difficult. I've been talked to answer my question.
Have you finished, Assemblymember Bailey?
Yes, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we please try and not talk over each other, and also
it's really
not
hard,
going
Chair,
to debate, stick to the questions. Okay, can we move on to the next question, which is from Assemblymember Russell, and that is the question number 1466, time to develop street space plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank the Assemblymember for her question? Our first priority is and was to ensure the safety of passengers and staff and the continued operation of our services for essential workers. We've been urgently enabling many more Londoners to walk and cycle. This will help maintain social distancing on transport and avoid a car-led recovery as government eases restrictions. We've launched My Street Space programme, the biggest and quickest transformation of the road environment in London ever. This will embed London as a global leader in walking and cycling. TfL modelling suggests there is a potential for a 10-fold increase in cycling and a fivefold increase in walking. We're creating one of the largest car-free areas of any capital city in the world. Working with the City of London and other councils, we're reallocating space to pedestrians and cyclists so people feel safe to return to work and to help maintain London's global competitiveness at this critical time. TfL only control the red routes, about 5% of London's roads, and so it does take a bit of time working with boroughs on three key areas we've been doing. Firstly, the rapid construction of a strategic cycling network using temporary materials. Secondly, the transformation of local centres to make local journeys safer and create safe space for queuing outside shops. And thirdly, reducing traffic on residential streets to create low traffic neighbourhoods. We've been working to ensure we have the materials, equipment and resources needed. We're working with ambitious boroughs and have secured funding for this in our deal with the government. We'll provide protection where possible on cycle superhighways 7 and 8, while cycleway 9 and cycleway 4 will be finished faster. TfL has already added around 5,000 square metres of extra space on footpaths across London and a new cycle lane on Park Lane. Footways have been widened in Camden, Stoke Newington, Brixton and Earls Court, and Broadway Market has been closed to traffic. These emergency temporary measures align with new government guidance issued shortly after we announced My Street Space programme. Making London a world-leading city in which to walk and cycle should be one of the few positives to come out of this awful, terrible virus and crisis, creating a healthier and greener city for all.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. When I submitted my question, other cities were way ahead of us, and I was literally jumping up and down with frustration. Paris had got their plans out a month ago, but I must now congratulate you, your Walking and Cycling Commissioner, and the Deputy Mayor. Your street-based plans now show how London can be resilient with the space on London streets used to support social distancing. How will you make sure that every Londoner benefits from these wider pavements, new bike lanes and low traffic neighbourhoods, and in particular that outer Londoners are not left out?
Can I thank you for your question? And you've always been collaborative on these issues, and I'm grateful. I would just add, one of the reasons why it may have appeared other cities were doing more than us is because the virus was ahead in those cities, and so their planning appeared to be before us. But I'm sure you'll agree, as the most comprehensive plans of any global city in the world. You're right, though, about outer London and making sure everyone benefits from the additional walking and cycling. So one of the things Will Norman has been doing, and I give him huge credit working with Heidi and the team, is been speaking to council leaders, particularly across the city, who really need alternatives to a car-led recovery. The Coalition of Willing are doing a great job, but if she's got influence over the Westminsters and the KNCs, I'd appreciate any help, because we've got to make sure we don't just have the good councils working with us so their citizens benefit, but also those councils who appear to be anti-walking, anti-cycling, and in favour of a car-led recovery, it seems.
Absolutely, I will. I'm entirely in support of avoiding a car-led recovery. I think that would be disastrous for us. I think some of the boroughs need some clarity about what funding is available to be bid for, and it would be very helpful if there could be more clarity for the boroughs about exactly what pots of money are available and how to bid for it. But yes, these people in outer London do need these wider pavements. They need the safer crossings just as much as people in inner London. So it is really important that we don't forget about them. Now, just looking at the cycle lane network for a moment, there's not much been done yet. You've started building a cycle lane on Park Lane. Do you know how many extra kilometres you will have provided by the end of June in inner and outer London?
I've got somewhere in my pack about the information. I can provide that to you offline. I mean, I think that's it's not quite right in relation to the size of Park Lane. There isn't much detail. There's a huge amount of additional kilometres added in cycling since we announced these plans. But also, just to reassure you, both Heidi and Will went to speak to council leaders as recently as last week to let them know about some of the funding available to support them with these plans. And one of the reasons why you're right, we've got to widen pavements in outer London as well, is because some of the queues outside shops and some of the queues at bus stops. But what I'll do is I'll make sure Will drops Caroline a line share, letting her know of our ambitions by the end of June, because what we're going to do is be even more ambitious than any city in the world.
That's great. And if you could make sure that breakdown is in terms of inner and outer London, that would be really helpful. I've got no further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Does Assemblymember Curtin want to come in on this question?
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning.
Good to see you. Now, on the same topic, I know that you've made proposals to turn many of the streets in the City of London area into a car-free zone, and your proposals that I've seen intend to make London Bridge, Waterloo Bridge, Clerkenwell Road, Kingsway, Moorgate, and Bishopsgate, and many other roads just available to walking, cycling, and buses only. Now, I'm sure you'd agree with me, Mr. Mayor, that black taxis, are a vital service for Londoners, particularly to disabled people, and they're 100% disabled access, and for people who can't walk and cycle readily in that area, or perhaps can't get a bus, rely on taxis. Now, your proposals didn't mention anything about taxis, but will those roads that you've said you want to just make for walking, cycling, and buses, will taxis be available? Will you allow taxis to continue to travel along those roads? Maybe that was just an oversight on your part, but what's your actual policy and proposal for taxis in your car-free zone?
Okay. Can I thank you for raising the question? And you're absolutely right. Taxis are accessible to those who are disabled. So TfL is looking into providing zero-emission capable taxis with access to both the bridges that you mentioned and other areas where traffic is resisted. And you're right. And so we will make sure that further details are announced as and when those changes are made.
Well, that's something, Mr. Mayor, talking about zero-emission capable taxis continuing to be able to go over London Bridge and Waterloo Bridge. But, there's many other roads as well. And if you come off Waterloo Bridge, you want to go up to Holborn, you need to go up to Kingsway. And you say that's not going to be available to taxis at the moment. You didn't mention that. You didn't mention Clerkenwell Road. You didn't mention Moorgate. You didn't mention Bishopsgate, for example. And, of course, at the moment, 75% of taxis are not zero emission capable. You've got many taxi drivers who have invested in sort of the TX4s before your policy came along to make all taxis zero emission capable. So what about those drivers who don't have a ZEC and who still need to perhaps take disabled passengers to a destination on Clerkenwell Road, for example?
Well, you'll be aware of the concerns we've got around air quality and the issues around NOx and carbon as well. So TfL are looking into the ZECs. But I'm more than happy for the Assembly member to speak to the Deputy Mayor and the Walking and Cycling Commissioner if there's any representations he wants to make in relation to plans going forward. It's really important we take on board the issues raised by others, but I'm keen to make sure that those who are disabled can continue to have access, but also we can continue to ensure that emergency services can have access as well. We're looking into ZECs, but if he wants to, he can raise this with my Deputy Mayor and organise a meeting for him to do so.
That would be very good, Mr. Mayor, because I think this is a very important issue for taxi drivers and also for people who rely on them. So I'll welcome your willingness to set up a meeting. Thank you.
Right. If we can move on to next question, which is question number 1474, and that is on COVID-19 morbidity rates in men. And the question is from Assembly Member Curtin. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. There is evidence that men and women are equally likely to acquire COVID-19, but men have a higher risk of severe illness and death. At the moment, the reasons behind this are unclear. Across the country, age remains the most significant demographic risk factor. Men from most BAME backgrounds also appear to be at greater risk from COVID-19. There's also evidence that COVID-19 deaths among the working age population, though relatively low overall, may be higher among men working in lower skilled occupations. In particular, occupations including security guards, taxi, bus and coach drivers and social care workers, reflecting some of the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19. There's also evidence that some of the economic and social impacts of the pandemic fall heavily on women. That's why I've called on the government to ensure that the equality impacts of the measures put in place are front and centre of the response. These inequalities are not new. Before the pandemic, London was facing real challenges around health inequalities. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these existing inequalities and created new ones. My team are working on a wide range of actions to understand the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 to all Londoners and to take action. We need to build up the data and evidence on the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 in London, including by gender. So we're working closely with Public Health England, who are reviewing the impact on BAME groups, which does include an analysis by gender as well. And we're also engaging with affected communities to ensure their voices are heard and provided coordinated funding through the London Community Response Fund to support groups responding to the needs of affected communities. But the government must also step up and play their part too.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I mean, as you said, men are a vast majority of the people who get a serious illness. Women are too, but 2/3 are men and 2/3 of the deaths are men, and that's in all ethnic groups. Have you got any advice specific to men or any sort of inkling or thoughts about what's causing this disparity and this inequality?
Yeah, really good point. So one of the things that I've asked UCL to do is not simply to look at the bus driver situation, but there's going to be several pieces of what they're doing around occupational hazards, but non-occupational hazards like age, gender, ethnicity, economic circumstances, living conditions, overcrowded housing. And so there could be some not just underlying health issues, but also some factors that could be doing where you live in, the type of housing, intergenerational living. And some of the occupations I've listed, I don't wish to form a stereotype, but the age profile of those professions and also sometimes the underlying health conditions can exacerbate the conditions. But you're right, 2 to 1 a factor of men versus women when it comes to deaths, which should be a cause for concern. And it's a pattern around the world actually as well, which is, I use the word interesting in the literal sense, not in any other sense. It's interesting. And so we're speaking to colleagues around the world as well about lessons learned. As you know, colleagues around the world had the virus before us, so there may be lessons we can learn from them sooner than us.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Right. Next question is from Assembly Member Cooper. Question number 1560 is about London's economy after lockdown. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask the Assembly Member for her question? COVID-19 is primarily a public health crisis, which has taken lives too soon and devastated families. Yet the economic impact of the outbreak and the restrictions brought in to tackle it will be far-reaching and long-lasting. And I'm determined to do all that I can to support our economy over the coming weeks and months. I welcome the government's decision to extend the job retention scheme until October. I've said repeatedly that this crisis will require long-term economic intervention from the government on an unprecedented scale. Government support must urgently include more help for small and medium-sized businesses which are struggling to pay rent and making more companies eligible for government support grants. Ministers must give businesses the help they need to stay afloat to support the capital's economic recovery in the future. And we must work in partnership to find ways to provide effective skills and employment support to the newly unemployed to get them back into work as soon as possible and to ensure that they continue to train and develop their skills. I'll be working with the government to explore ways to do this, including through the adult skills system and the unique expertise of London boroughs. Let's not forget the impact of the lockdown will also have an impact on crucial negotiations around our long-term relationship with the EU. Once the transition period comes to an end, this will add further complexity to an already enormously difficult situation. However, I remain optimistic that London's dynamic economy will weather the storm of these unprecedented times. We're a resilient city which has overcome huge challenges in the past, and I know we can do so again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and can I commend you on the leadership that you've shown over the last 4 years in the face of terror attacks, and now I think Londoners will be looking to you to see us being led out of this appalling situation and trying to revive London. I think one of the biggest issues, though, is about confidence of all of us personally to start going back out and becoming, customers again, and also the confidence of businesses and the workers in them. And one of the huge concerns that has been going on since the beginning of this crisis has been about the level of PPE that has been available. Do you feel confident,
given the problems that we've had, getting it to the NHS, getting it into social care settings, that as we start to unlock the economy, that PPE in adequate amounts is going to be available for staff and also for customers, so that we can have that confidence to start reviving the economy.
So can I speak as so personal protective equipment, the focus should be on the NHS and care homes. At the moment, we think we've got okay supplies for NHS. We're a bit worried about care homes going forward with future supplies. We've been behind the curve in relation to our response to this virus as a country. Actually, the real challenge when we start easing restriction is test, trace, isolate, support. Whilst the virus appears to be lower in London, now is the time, the window of opportunity, to make sure people can be tested quickly. If they've got it, trace those they've been in contact with, isolate and support. And that will give confidence as lockdown is eased. The advice now is still to have lockdown, but the big concern I've got, addition to the one you've raised, is will these businesses be there when lockdown is lifted, or they've closed down because of the challenges they're facing?
Oh, absolutely, Mr. Mayor. And I think one of the schemes that a lot of people have raised with me that they've really liked is your Pay It Forward initiative. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about how well that is supporting small, medium and other businesses, and what more we can do from the GLA, the Greater London Authority, to support businesses to make sure they are there when this is when we do start to properly unlock.
No, thank you for the question. So Pay It Forward London is a scheme that's now been replicated around the world. Clearly without London, Pay It Forward, Budapest will Pay It Forward, other cities. And what it means is that those of us who want to pay now for goods and services we may receive in the future can give a cash flow and a lifeline to these businesses, often very small businesses. We're supporting 1,600, 1,600 members of the public have come forward to support the businesses, actually the tune of more than £100,000 already. It's really important that we continue to do so. And these are lifelines, because many of these businesses haven't got a big loan facility or an overdraft, and the services that we pay for the wages and the rent and the business rate. So it's really important Londoners continue to be generous as they've been doing, and I'm so proud of our city and their generosity. And Pay It Forward London is a really good thing we could all do to help small businesses who provide goods and services.
No, thank you very much for setting that up, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Chair. I'm finished now.
Right, we move on to next question, which is from Assembly Member Hall. Question number 1527 on GLA budget. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Can I thank Assembly Member Hall for a question? COVID-19 is having a massive impact on finances across the GLA group. In addition to the impact on TfL's finances that we've discussed separately, from additional PPE for firefighters to providing hostel accommodation for rough sleepers, supporting the wider response and the necessary temporary closure of construction sites, there has been a significant impact on all organisations. We know that some planned events and activities will not be possible while social distancing requirements are in force. A new expenditure will be required to support Londoners as our economy and society recover from the virus's impact. Work is currently underway to understand these impacts and to forecast the loss of business rate and council tax income that may arise. This is dependent on information from borough treasurers and officers, and working closely with them to obtain as accurate a picture as we can at this early stage. I've instructed the Executive Director of Resources to bring forward the preparation of my budget guidance in order that I can publish it in early June. This will set out our best understanding of the situation and the approach to be adopted. Until this work is complete, I'm not in a position to take decisions regarding areas to be protected or prioritised. What I can say is that I met very recently, last week, virtually with GLA Group Chief Officers, and we agreed to take forward at pace opportunities that have been identified to further improve our effectiveness and efficiency through more collaboration. I'm determined to do all I can to protect the services which Londoners rely upon.
Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for that. I accept that you can't give us an absolute, but I'm trying to get a flavour of the sort of areas you might think of having to make savings, because obviously the savings will have massive implications, but equally the financial recovery in London is vital. So can you give us a flavour of where you're looking to make savings in the GLA budget specifically?
Well, obviously the key thing is to make sure we can help with the recovery. One of the things I'll be doing shortly is to lead in the recovery in London. So clearly those of our services that would help in the recovery would be areas to be prioritised. Those services that are public events, which may not be able to happen, are clearly services that we can make savings on and announce pretty quickly they're not going to happen, and we can make savings there. I'll give you one example. You may have seen recently the announcement of the Carnival being postponed this year. That was a huge saving to us because we support the Carnival financially with student, etc. There are other examples like that. Well, there'll be savings going forward, but once the budget guidance has been produced, I'll be able to give you, I know you're in your role as the chair of the committee, you'll be needing this, more of the flavour of the sort of changes we're talking about.
Right, Assembly Member Hall, is that it? Or
sorry, my screen froze completely, so I missed the last part of that. So thank you for what you said, Mr. Mayor, although I didn't get the benefit of the end part of it. Can I ask you then, as this is so critical to London, will you be prepared to come to the next budget and performance meeting and answer far more in-depth questions on what we're going to be doing with the budget, because it is very, very urgent?
I'm always happy to come to the committee, so I'm sure we can organise that.
But Mr. Mayor, you're not. This is the trouble. We've been trying to get you for a couple of months to come to this. You've been very much a missing mayor so far as we're concerned. We do want to be asking you questions. You are the mayor, so if I can take that as a commitment to come, we will...
Can I just look? I ain't the guy that hides in a fridge, yeah? I've been happy to answer questions to the Assembly whenever the Assembly wants me to do so. I'm more than happy to do this meeting virtually, and I'm more than happy to go to the Budget and Performance Committee. And no other mayor has opened themselves up to the scrutiny that I have, and I'll continue to do so, Chair.
Mr. Mayor, that is absolute rubbish. You're quite happy to go on radio shows with James O'Brien, etc., write all sorts of things for leaflets, pamphlets, and goodness knows what else. But we have been asking you to have this meeting for at least a couple of months. And at last we're there, but I do hope you will come to the Budget and Performance Committee where we can ask you specifically what you're going to do with the finances. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Let's move on. Assembly Member Duval, do you want to come in? You indicated before.
Mr. Mayor, in terms of some of the current budget issues coming on, and bearing in mind the negotiations that you indicated earlier around the concessionary access fares, and of course we'll get to the bottom of who said what. I'm very much along on your side of version of events from what happened at that particular time when government came out to brief against you. Is one of the implications of any changes to the under-16 schemes one where what I think happens outside London, that local authorities pick up the bill in budgetary issues around concessionary for under-16s? Surely government can't be contemplating that change when we come to review concessionary access schemes in the future.
And this is just one example of how ill thought the government's punishment of Londoners was, because in London we have quite a simple system: free bus travel for those under 16, under 18. But what you're right to remind us of is the complexity. So if some school children go to a school further away from the home, above 1 mile or above 2 miles, they're eligible for free bus travel. If some children have special needs, they're eligible for certain types of bus travel. Certain faith denominations have different rules, and so this is a real quagmire. And I think this is the government's not realised the hornet's nest this is. And so if the government is insistent in taking away free bus travel for those below the age of 18, it may mean local authorities having to pick up some of the bill. And that's what I'm really keen, and I've given my permission for the agreement to be published as soon as possible so Londoners can see for themselves. What I'd rather do, in addition to that, is the government work with me. Why play party politics? Why not work with us to find a solution that addresses the concerns we've all got to make finite resources spread further? And I'd hope they do that rather than briefing, as they've been doing against myself, Nicola Sturgeon, Mark Drayford in Scotland and Wales, and work with us. I appreciate I've got an election next May, but stop playing party politics and work with us to get through this.
Mr. Mayor, on the enhanced package that we offer Londoners around the over 60s and the Freedom Pass. Is it your view that you will do your best to defend those enhanced packages when we come to the review and come outside this emergency to restore those packages in full, and that the government needs to think very carefully if it thinks unconstitutionally that it's going to go against London wishes? This scheme has been supported in the past by some Conservatives. I hope they continue to support it again in the future. So where's your position on that?
Well, the good news is I think calmer heads prevailed in relation to the disabled persons card. I mean, initially, you'll be aware, last Thursday, the government wanted to remove that as well. And you'll be aware that actually a big component of this is paid for by local authorities. And so it's really important that we're cognizant of that. And so, look, now that Number 10 have calmed down, and I hope Assembly Bailey has calmed down, we need now the government to work with us in a cross-party fashion to come to a resolution that works for London in the medium term and long term. This sticking plaster of a deal only lasts 4.5 months. We'll run out of the monies by the end of September because we have the fares coming on stream. And so we need a deal then that works for London in the medium to long term. And you're right, when the Prime Minister was the mayor, he didn't dare do this. So why is he trying to do this now in the safety of Number 10 Downing Street?
Thank you.
Right, we have Assembly Member Buff's question on housing and planning. Question number 1499, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for the question. This pandemic has thrown housing inequality in London into even starker relief and highlighted the urgent need for every Londoner to have access to a safe, good quality home they can afford. Many Londoners have had to face this crisis without security of tenure in the private rented sector or in overcrowded homes, temporary accommodation or on the streets. The immediate focus of my team has therefore been to support the most vulnerable Londoners, in particular rough sleepers, and I pay huge credit to Tom Copley for the work he's done over the last few weeks in this area. I've also called on the government to provide greater support and protections to London's private renters, many of whom are at immediate risk of losing their homes through absolutely no fault of their own. My London housing strategy and London plan are policies for the long term. The vision that they support is focused on good quality, genuinely affordable homes in greener neighbourhoods, and that vision remains important and relevant during the coronavirus pandemic as it will afterwards. It is too soon to determine what the long-term effects will be on London's economy and on housing need and supply. We're working closely with partners to understand the wide-ranging housing impacts of this pandemic. In the event of an economic downturn, it is likely that demand for homes at social rent levels will grow. My Deputy for Housing, Tom Copley, has established a housing delivery task force to ensure that together we can emerge from this crisis ready to continue our work to build a home that Londoners need. And I'm working with the government to publish the London plan as soon as possible to provide the much needed certainty to the sector and an extension of the Affordable Homes programme. It's clear that the vision for London set out in my London plan and the genuinely affordable homes delivered through my funding programmes are more important than ever. We can't tackle London's housing crisis without adequate, secure and long-term government funding.
Mr. Mayor, on the 9th of April, Karen Buck retweeted figures from the Resolution Foundation, which revealed that 16% of the families living in lockdown were in overcrowded conditions. In doing so, she said, try living through this on the 16th floor with 3 kids in 1 bedroom, or with twins with autism but no garden, or with a mum and dad sleeping on the living room floor, so a severely disabled child can have a bedroom. This week, Dr. Onka Sahota sent you a letter from the Health Committee, which outlined their review of your health strategy, which included a recommendation that you should examine your policies on family-sized homes, particularly in the light of COVID-19, to ensure that they match up with the objectives of your health policy. The number of family-sized homes being built is declining. Your housing strategy removed any targets for family-sized homes.
You can hear it.
And your London plan encourages the building of those smaller properties that 360,000 young people have been enduring during this lockdown. Isn't it time for you, Mr. Mayor, to reintroduce investment targets for family-sized homes?
Well, firstly, let's be clear. The previous London plan and the previous housing strategy did not have a target for family-sized homes. My London plan, for the first time, requires councils to set a mix for the requirement for social housing based on local needs. That's because I recognise we need to have decent-sized housing that is affordable, and that's why it should be those on social need. If it was the case, we were to have large numbers of market value family homes being built in London. A large number of those would not be affordable by the family you referred to in Karen Buck MP's tweet. The sort of home that family needs is a decent-sized home that is available on social rent, and that's why I'm requiring council for the first time to undertake a exercise to work out what their local needs are, based on things like their housing needs and how many families they have. And that's the way, in addition to our other policies, to meet the needs of those families who desperately need decent-sized homes.
Mr. Mayor, we've recently seen figures produced that indicate that most of the overcrowding in housing in London is in socially rented homes over which you have some influence. I'd like to refer you, incidentally, I don't particularly want to go through he said, this, you said stuff, but page 29 of the previous housing strategy had a very clear commitment to 36% discounted rented homes to be 3 bedrooms or larger. I don't want to go over the last measure because I was quite
question, please.
That was an aspiration. That was an aspiration. That was an aspiration.
Yeah, perhaps you would refer to me to the aspiration in your housing strategy and your London plan to tackling this crisis. Now, the fact is, Mr. Mayor, that you're going to be doing nothing for those very people that Karen Buck is trying to represent, those people that came into her surgery. You're doing nothing for them because your London plan encourages the building of 1-bedroom homes. And there's no money that goes with the London plan, and it means the boroughs will continue to build those traps and those jails for overcrowded families. Mr. Mayor, you need to revisit this. I'm looking for an undertaking, as is Dr. Sahota, for you to review your overcrowding policies.
Chair, it's very difficult virtually with a 5-minute question and not be given a chance to respond. Like, if I could respond to the various points raised by some member.
Your chance is now, Mr. Mayor.
Quite. So firstly, this is the first London plan that requires councils to carry out an assessment of what their local needs are, so developers, housing associations and others can make sure there are decent numbers of family-sized homes made that are available to those on housing waiting lists. The reason why it's those who are in council accommodation who suffer the most overcrowding is because of the failure of the governments, successive governments, to successively replenish the stock of those homes sold under right to buy. I'd remind the Assembly member, for every 5 homes sold under right to buy, only 1 had been replaced. But the problem is his governments, because the funding they've given us is disproportionately skewed towards intermediate housing, which is 1 and 2 bedroom. If he could use his influence over his government to persuade them to give us funding that helps us fund family-sized social homes, would be able to do so. But here's the good news. Notwithstanding that, over the last 3 years, we have broken record after record of the amount of genuinely affordable homes begun in our city, which are helping those families. The most recent figures published shows last year we began more than 17,000 genuinely affordable homes. Of those, more than 7,000 were social rent, more than 3,000 council homes. Just one example of the difference a Labour mayor is making. But we could do far, far more with a decent deal from the government. And that's why I said in my opening, we're now working on the next deal with the government. If he has any influence over the government, he should use it to say to the government, use this awful crisis and the potential recession as an opportunity to properly fund council homes. The cross-subsidy model is not working. We need decent-sized family homes for those on the council housing waiting list.
Mr. Mayor, the 360,000 children living in overcrowded conditions were looking for a mayor who was going to be with them. What they've got is a missing mayor.
Let me respond to that point, Chaz, because I know you're going to be fair and impartial. So the point that's been made is that I'm a missing mayor and these children are looking for me for help. And that's one of the motivations for the record number of council homes. The last time we began more than 3,000 council homes was in 1982. I was 12 years old. That's the difference I'm making to these families. But also what these families are looking for is leadership from Conservative members of the Assembly who've got influence over their Conservative friends in government. Use that influence to lobby them to give us a decent deal to make sure we can build family-sized council homes and increase the supply of genuine affordable homes in our great city.
Right. I think there's been enough questions and explanation. Can we move on to the next question? Before I do that, can I please ask all our colleagues to make sure that your devices are on mute when you're not speaking, because getting a lot of background interruptions and noise. Thank you. I'm going to, Mr. Mayor, bring forward two questions from the agenda. They're both to do with housing and homelessness. If you can, therefore, look at question from Assembly Member Barry, which is question number 1467, and that is on people facing street homelessness in London. 1467, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. I'm proud that my team, led by Deputy Mayor Tom Copley, have been working with charities and other partners and have quickly led the way to protect one of the most vulnerable groups in our city, rough sleepers, during this pandemic. We're now accommodating and supporting over 1,200 rough sleepers across 14 GLA-procured hotels, with many more similarly accommodated by London's councils. This work has meant that they can observe social distancing and other public health guidelines and stay safe. I welcome the backing the government's given to our work by both providing funding towards the operation and rolling out our approach nationwide. But you're right to highlight that there are still people sleeping rough. Outreach teams are still going out, and since lockdown began, the number of people they've seen each week has varied between 400 and 800. Around 40% are already known to services, but shockingly, most are new to the streets. Although some people have refused offers of support, many want and need accommodation. To meet this continuing demand, we've recently engaged an additional hotel, making over 100 additional beds available. This will help a significant number of people for now, but the government needs to commit to cover the cost of any further accommodation needed. I'm deeply worried that government now appears to be backtracking on their earlier commitments to protect vulnerable rough sleepers. Clarity is urgently needed on the next steps, both of those still on the streets and the thousands accommodated in hotels supported by City Hall and London's councils. The government must also do more to stop people ending up on the streets during the pandemic. Council homelessness services need clarity from the government that they can and should be assisting those not normally entitled to help, including many non-UK nationals, and assurance that accommodation will be funded as lockdown is eased.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, for your answer there. I think all of your work on this is welcome, and this is a topic I last discussed with you at the last Mayor's Question Time in person as well. You've clearly made progress, but there are still people obviously on the streets, as you report, between 400 and 800 people. And I'm very concerned also about new flows of people onto the streets. The Housing Committee's report, Hidden Homelessness, found there were 13 times more people on any given night who were homeless but coping in other ways, sofa surfing, maybe staying on public transport, than there were people sleeping on the streets. Streets Kitchen, a charity doing outreach work, they are saying that they are busier than ever. And I think we do need to make sure in the short term we keep the capacity in the hotel schemes growing and growing as much as we can. You mentioned the further support from government. You've had no clarity and clarification, presumably, on that since the rumours a few days ago that they were withdrawing support from councils. What are you doing to get more information about that? And is there any way in which we as Assembly members can help pressure the government to keep this going, or we do risk putting many more people into harm's way?
Yeah, thank you for your points, your questions. So the two areas of concern where you can help me is, one, in relation to ongoing support. Secondly, is those new rough sleepers. And you'll be aware we have a far more sophisticated way of assessing rough sleeping by the outreach work we do than other parts of the country. Other parts of the country have the one count in autumn. We have the regular chain data, which is very accurate, and you'll know from the report that's been done about the concerns we have. And the third area is for those who've got no recourse to public funds. There is a real concern of what happens to them, and so any help in those three areas is appreciated. There's been radio silence from the government on those areas in relation to our lobbying. The good news, though, is the government have asked Dame Louise Case to continue her work, her excellent work in this area, and she's passionate about ending rough sleeping, for it to be a revolving door. We are trying to persuade the government to adopt our In for Good principle, which we've been using for our outreach work and our winter shelter programme. That could really be a game changer to avoid the revolving door.
Okay, so just moving on now to private renters. As you know, the loss of private tenancy is one of the leading causes of homelessness. And there's a big issue brewing now at the moment with renters who will be stuck with large rent arrears built up over the crisis. I've called for an extension to the halt on eviction proceedings, and I've said that arrears should be forgiven, with landlords in need able to claim back lost income. I said this yesterday to the Minister for London. The New Economics Foundation, who you've worked with on renters' rights, and the London Renters Union are also calling for rent forgiveness. So will you join us in calling for these two key policies?
I think I was there first, but we're not going to argue about that. But my triple lock talks about that issue. And also I've said to the government they should step up in relation to support for landlords who may struggle. And one of the ways they could do very quickly is increasing the London housing allowance. Very simple thing they can do, which would really help fill the gap. But also they should be supporting those landlords. And just, you've got to remember that there may be...
Mr. Mayor, sorry, I'm running out of my time, as we all do. I asked you about extending the rent, the eviction proceedings ban, and forgiving arrears that have been built up so far. As far as I can tell, your triple lock merely extends the period of repayment for arrears. The principle here should be that renters should not be shouldering the burden of these arrears, that the government should be helping small landlords the way they help any other small business.
Well, that's what I've said. But so what I've said is, look, so as far as the government's going to extend the period from June on no evictions onwards, they've got to amend Section 8. So arrears can't be used as a basis for the evictions as well. We're worried about that. But also they should be supporting those landlords, many of whom may have the property as their pension, and they've got to pay the mortgage, which will continue in relation to...
Can I get clarity just in my last 30 seconds? You are supporting that the arrears should be cancelled for renters who have run into arrears problems during this crisis in the current period, as opposed to going forwards?
What I'm saying is the government should be supporting those landlords who are having problems because renters haven't been able to pay their rent. Renters should be supported by the eviction period being extended beyond June, and there should also be a position where those tenants who've got rent arrears, that isn't the basis for which they can be evicted in the future.
But you're still saying they should pay it back. I'm not sure that is the answer that I was hoping for, but hopefully we can persuade you to change your tune in future weeks.
Assembly Member Barry, sorry you run out of your time. Thank you very much. Right. I also brought forward another question, which is rough sleepers during coronavirus. And that's the question number 1596, Mr. Mayor, from Assembly Member Qureshi.
Well, it's good to see Senator Qureshi also back in the Assembly. The effort of Tom Copley, our team, charities, councils and others, supported by the government, has been phenomenal. What we've done in London is world leading. And whereas other cities in advanced nations around the world are sadly seeing high numbers of homeless people with COVID-19, in London, the overwhelming majority of our rough sleepers are safely accommodated and thus much better protected from the virus. Our commissioned charities are now working intensively with those in the hotels, some of whom are long-term rough sleepers who have refused help until now. We absolutely must take advantage of this opportunity and adopt my In for Good principle so that no one we're accommodating now needs to return to the streets when lockdown is lifted. First, we need government to commit to funding secure long-term solutions for every single rough sleeper we've helped during the emergency. Second, they must be open to policy changes across departments that we need to avoid large numbers of people returning to the streets. That includes policy relating to non-UK nationals and those with no recourse to public funds. And third, we need government to make crucial changes to the welfare system and the private rented sector to prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place and provide us with resources to continue to help those sleeping rough on our streets. The proposals and calls for investment outlined in my Rough Sleep Plan for Action are as relevant now as when first published back in 2018.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I first thank the Chair for bringing my question forward after Assembly Member Berry? I think that was the most important thing. And can I also say I'm glad to be back in this momentous year. I've always felt to get anything done in London, you need a 5-year term. That's how long it usually takes to get things done in London. That said, can I also give my gratitude as someone who lives on the gateway to the West End, that something major is being done on rough sleeping, since we've seen the numbers more than double over austerity, and it's taken a pandemic threat for something like this major to happen. Saying that, can I just have an update on a few things, Mr. Mayor? Can you tell us what's likely to happen to those housed in hotels once the hotels, for example, want to reopen to the public again?
Well, thank you, Chair. Thank you for your question. I'm looking forward to at least a 9-year term rather than a 5-year one. But that's a big concern in relation to what happens in relation to those in hotels. And so the hotel owners and runners have been fantastic, by the way. We clearly can't, from City Hall, fund in perpetuity these hotel rooms. So we need some security of funding from central government. And we are concerned about having that security of funding from central government. We're hopeful that Dame Louise Casey's work may provide one of the solutions going forward. But that's one of the questions that does cause Tom and our team some sleepless nights about how we're going to continue the good work we've done. What we don't want to do is seeing these people back on the streets. That's why if the government can adopt our In for Good principle, it means we can provide the wraparound support package, even though not necessarily a permanent home, to have a pathway of getting off our streets.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's reassuring to hear that. Last night when I walked along the Edge Road, there are still some rough sleepers out there. Let's face it, about 10% are considered missing. I met, for example, Danny, who's an ex-army soldier who's underneath the Marylebone flyover. What else can we expect all the agencies to be doing during the lockdown with this missing 10%?
Yeah, it is a big concern. We have got new people sleeping rough who weren't there a few weeks ago. Some of them actually are EU citizens without residence requirements. Some of those who've lost their jobs in hospitality recently. Some of those who've got no recourse to public funds. Some of those who, it's not criticism, it's just a fact, don't want to go to a shelter or a hotel or be given help. Some have complex needs, alcohol dependencies or drug issues. And so we work with brilliant charities and frontline organisations who go out and are experts in this area. And so we'll continue to work with them about how we can do that. And if anybody, you mentioned your experience on Edgware Road, Edgware Street. I mean, many of us must be observing lockdown, but if you're out and about and see people, please do use the StreetLink app and let people know, and they will go out and help them.
Yeah, that's thank you, Mr. Mayor, for reminding me. That's exactly what I've been doing. Now, your initiative has managed to house about 1,200 people at £10 million cost. Will the government continue to pick up the cost for whatever needs to be done at the end of the arrangement you've got with the hotels?
That's the concern we've got. Those are the discussions we're having with the government, because obviously we've got a finite amount of support from the government to help with the pandemic, and just the hotel, rough sleeping, homelessness area is about £20 million worth of expenditure. That's over 12 weeks. If the pandemic, as we expect it maybe, goes on for longer, then it gets even further. And that's why it's really important for us to continue to revisit and review this, because it would be heartbreaking if because we had not enough money, we'd had to say to these rough sleepers, you've now got to leave the hotels because we've run out of money, and they ended up back on the streets. We went from a situation now of about 400 rough sleepers to potentially 1,600.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, for the update.
Assembly Member Boff, you had indicated. Do you want to come in on this one? Assembly Member Boff, can you hear me? No, I think we move on to the next question then. Going back to the order of agenda again, it is question from Assembly Member Dr. Sahota, question number 1602, which is on social justice through the pandemic.
Thank you, Chair. Can I begin, Chair, by thanking Senator Dr. Sahota and members of his family, as well as everyone else who's been on the front line during this crisis, knowing full well the risks that entails. Every death as a result of this disease is an absolute tragedy, leaving behind a family and community bereaved. We must never lose sight of the fact that we're not discussing statistics, but real people. Londoners who have lost their lives in these most tragic of circumstances. As Dr. Sahota says, COVID-19 does not discriminate who it infects, but we know that it doesn't mean that the impact of this crisis is being felt equally. The virus is not a great leveller. The latest stats from the ONS show that BAME men are up to 4 times more likely to die from the virus. It exposes the grim reality of these structural inequalities that have existed in our society for far too long now. We know that minority ethnic Londoners are more likely to work in lower paid jobs, live in overcrowded accommodation, and suffer from underlying health conditions, putting them at greater risk from the virus. We need an inquiry into these inequalities urgently, and I'm glad that Public Health England is looking into this. We also need to understand what the underlying causes are, and that's why I've also written to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to undertake a full inquiry into the matter from a wider perspective. As I've already mentioned, accurate data collection is key. I called on the government to record ethnicity on death certificates to reveal the true extent of this disproportionate impact. And last week, I convened a roundtable to hear first-hand from BAME frontline workers, academics and experts. One important action that came out of this discussion was an understanding that we cannot go back to business as usual when it comes to inequality. Every Londoner deserves to be able to lead safe, healthy and happy lives regardless of their background or ethnicity.
Right. Dr. Sahota, you want to come back on this?
Indeed, I do. I had muted myself, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for all the leadership you've shown during this pandemic. And I was listening earlier on how you were unfairly being criticised for the non-surgical mask delivery to the TFL staff. The opinion of the world community has been very uncertain on masks up till now, and you have been leading up front. But I tell you, what has been certain from the beginning has been that the way to address this, right, was through testing. And this government wasted valuable time in getting PPE ready for us and getting testing ready on time for us. And this has really been magnified in our nursing homes and social care homes. What do you say about that? Why does the government waste 7 weeks of valuable time in preparing this country for dealing with this pandemic?
Well, you and members of your family who serve on the front line know full well how ill-equipped you've been in relation to lack of preparedness. And one of the things we've got to be aware of is deflection away from us asking these big questions about why weren't you making PPE, why aren't you providing the PPE? But testing is a really important one and relevant today, because we know, because the government failed to order the right level of tests, on March the 12th, they changed their advice to test and trace. And that, I think, was a big mistake. But we now have a window of opportunity to make sure we don't lead to a second wave that could overwhelm the NHS. We know in London, the numbers of people with COVID-19 is relatively low. The number of new cases is relatively low. So we have a small window of opportunity to properly test, trace, isolate and support. That means if somebody thinks they've got the symptoms, test and have the results back within 24 hours, find out who they've been in contact with if they tested positive, trace them, test them, quick results back, trace and isolate and support. And that way we'll stay on top of the virus. And my worry is, Anka, we as a country have been behind the curve and an outlier rather than being prepared in advance of this virus coming. And we now got a chance, because of the low levels in London, to get ahead of the curve. And I hope the government takes up my offer for London to do test, trace, isolate, support from now. We're ready.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, has the government been in touch with you for testing out this appliance, this NHS app, right? They're testing out on the Isle of Wight, which is totally different from a city like London. Has there been any approach from the government to you whether they can test it out in a city like London?
No, it's reverse. So there hasn't been an approach. I then wrote to the government saying, look, Isle of Wight is an island that's very different to London. You should be also piloting a borough or two in London. using the NHS X app. The thin walls we have in London, the higher density, people travelling on a bus. I mean, you can imagine the false positives you may have. And so I said, listen, we're happy, just do it in a borough first. And the borough leader's happy to use a borough as a pilot. The government said no. So we now got the situation where the Prime Minister promised, because he was under pressure at Prime Minister's questions, that he would roll out test, trace, isolate support from the 1st of June at big numbers. And the concern is we'll be using this app in London, not tested before in this sort of environment, query whether it'll work. And you can often be in contact with somebody in a shop or public transport without realising you're in close contact. So you telling somebody I was in close contact with ABCD is fine, but the app would really help. And so I'm worried, but that notwithstanding that, I still think there's an opportunity for us to test, trace, isolate, because we're ahead of the rest of the country. Our numbers are so small now, we can do it now, whereas other parts of the country, the northeast, the northwest, can't. Use this opportunity, or if you don't, we could have another second wave, which I think is unforgiving.
Exactly. And I know that there's even talk about that London might come out of lockdown quicker than the rest of the country, and I think it's very important, if that's to happen, that we have a proper system of testing, tracking and tracing in place. And I hope the government will work with you and also work with the local authorities and make sure with public health right, rather than doing it through a private company which they've approached. The other thing, Mr. Mayor, of course, is that countries which have done well are the ones who had a good healthcare system before they went into the pandemic. And of course, in this country, the NHS has faced austerity, and particularly in London, we have 9,000 vacancies of nurses. And of course, we should put pressure on the government to get this absolutely right. And also, I think what they've done recently in terms of healthcare professionals coming over from overseas working in the NHS, putting on the health charge from £400 to £624. That's giving a kick in the mouth, right, to all those people who've come to this country who've actually died looking after us. And I hope that you will put pressure on the government to reverse those healthcare charges and also to take this opportunity of rebuilding the NHS.
Well, can I say thank you for that? But in addition to those from overseas who've helped London, we've had NHS staff from around the country helping London because we were ahead of the curve. And it's amazing, this sort of the NHS ethos where you could be an NHS member of staff working elsewhere in the country, but you've come to London to help us out, not just with NHS Nightingale, but other parts of the NHS family in London as well. You're right to remind us of the record numbers of vacancies in London, which has been caused by a number of the policies. But also, it's worth reminding ourselves that Public Health England and health protection teams have been hollowed out with austerity over the last 10 years as well. It's really important to realise we were not best prepared to deal with this global pandemic.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Right. Next question is from Assembly Member Desai. Question number, Mr. Mayor, it's 1566, policing during the coronavirus crisis.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Assembly Member for his question. Officers and staff of the Met Police have been continuing their important work to keep Londoners safe in unprecedented circumstances, and I want to take this opportunity to thank them for their service. I've been in regular contact with the Commissioner throughout this crisis and have been reassured by the approach the Met has taken, which includes issuing over 900 fixed penalty notices between 28th of March and 11th of May. The police have been playing a crucial role by engaging with the public, explaining these rules, encouraging compliance, and only resorting to enforcement where necessary. It's heartening to see that the vast majority of Londoners have been adhering to the new public health laws, and recent Moveback surveys suggest that 86% of Londoners feel confident in the ability of the Met to handle this outbreak. To aid officers, the Met has been receiving guidance from a range of expert sources, including the National Police Chiefs Council, the College of Policing, and the Crown Prosecution Service, and this guidance has been updated as the relevant health regulations have changed. Unfortunately, what isn't assisting the Met is the confused communications from the government. As noted by the Police Federation, by not providing clear and ambiguous messaging and guidance, the government are making officers' jobs much more difficult. As lockdown is gradually lifted, the government's messaging must be clear and realistic so that it does not place competing demands on the police at this crucial time. As a result of the lockdown measures, we've seen a reduction in some crime types. But I can assure you that officers are continuing to protect the vulnerable from harm, to support victims of crime, and are working tirelessly to tackle the scourge of violent crime. My team and I are working to prepare London for the next phase of this crisis, and we're working closely with partners, including the Met, to respond to the easing of lockdown conditions and to ensure London remains a safe place to live, to work and to visit.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Firstly, can I take this opportunity to wish you and your family Eid Mubarak greetings in advance, and through you to all Londoners who will be marking the occasion this coming weekend. I went to a virtual iftar on Friday. It was a different experience. The community spirit in City and East London is really, really great. So, anyway, thank you for your answer. You talked about planning for the next stage in terms of keeping London safe as lockdown restrictions start easing. Can you tell us specifically how are you and the Met preparing to ensure that we don't see a steep rise in crime, and particularly violent crime, when restrictions are lifted? Police officers have warned of a spike in crime once the current lockdown measures are lifted.
Yeah, can I say this is a big concern police officers have, but also those involved in crime prevention have, but also youth workers are worried by the consequences. Liv Peck, the director of the VRU, is doing some good work here. And the reason why we're concerned is because without excusing criminality, the underlying conditions which lead to criminality, deprivation, poverty, lack of opportunity, those aren't just still there, they've been compounded by 8 weeks of lockdown, with potentially more lockdown in the future. So it's a combination of concerns by police, young people and youth services. So a number of things we're doing. On the crime prevention stuff, the Violence Reduction Unit are working virtually with other groups across London, youth groups, youth organisations, Young Londoners Fund, to see what they're doing with WhatsApp groups, with social media and other forms to keep young people engaged and keep in a good mental health space as well. Secondly, the Commissioner announced a new initiative of 620 officers involved in violence suppression units in all 12 basic command units, and they've got micro hotspots of crime which they're worried about. And the third thing is I'm lobbying the Prime Minister to give us support to deal with the causes of crime, to make sure we don't have a big spike after we come out of lockdown.
Thank you. And just very quickly, Mr. Mayor, two key concerns I want to raise with you from a policing perspective regarding the response to the crisis. What continued work are you doing to ensure victims of domestic abuse are able to report and to get the support they need? And secondly, the issue of hate crimes against our East Asian communities in particular. The Home Office Minister has said there hasn't been an increase in far-right extremist activity, but there has been some rise in hate crime. So how are you making sure that this community is still protected as lockdown restrictions are eased?
Well, firstly, the good news, in your second question, which is no complacency, but there appears to not have been the increase in further raised crimes against the Southeast Asian community that we saw a number of weeks ago. That's good news. But we'll keep an eye on this. We're vigilant. In relation to domestic abuse, whereas other crime areas have seen some reduction, domestic abuse has seen an increase. We are worried about this. We don't want people to suffer in silence. I put aside an additional £1.5 million to support the £59 million I've been given, and that's led to a new accommodation being made available for those people fleeing domestic abuse, domestic violence, including those with children. And those premises are live, and our partners are working to get these victims and survivors of domestic abuse rehoused away from perpetrators safely.
And finally, Mr. Mayor, you should write to me on this, but the use of stop and search has gone up by 45% last month on the same period last year. Can you explain why this has been, why there has been this increase, and how officers are conducting the searches particularly safely given the current crisis?
Well, I mean, the Commissioner and I discussed this the last time we spoke, and as far as the police are concerned, they're still following the normal guidance they do. The law's the law. They're still using the body-worn video. The use of the body-worn video is still very high. The complaints are still low. There are still, I'm afraid, disproportionality. But I just remind you and colleagues, actually, that the age profile of young Londoners is disproportionately of certain ethnic backgrounds and stuff, and the areas we've had high violent crime is in some boroughs. That's not in any way to minimise or trivialise this issue. It's an issue the Commissioner takes seriously. She understands the concerns I, you, others have raised, and we're keen to improve this. One of the ways we can lead to these communities having more confidence with the police is to address this issue. and we're keen to make sure we address it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And through you, can we thank, I'm sure all my colleagues will join me in thanking all our officers on the front line who are doing so much to keep our city safe. Thank you to you and your team.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Whittle, you have a follow-up question to this one?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning.
Hope your family are keeping well at this time. I just want to ask, we haven't had the chance to talk about how the police have responded, since we last met you to discuss everything. I wondered, if you go back to the beginning of this pandemic, there was an incident on Westminster Bridge, if you remember, where the police were there, including the Commissioner, Cressida Dick, and a great deal of people who obviously not socially distanced at all. And it worries me because of the consistency or lack of the police response to this pandemic. You said at the time that I believe that questions would probably have to be asked. I wonder, did you ask questions about that? And if so, what were the answers?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Thank you very much for asking about my family. It's very kind of you. We're okay, thank you. So yes, my deputy mayor did raise it with, did discuss it with the Commissioner. And on that night in particular, my understanding is that people spontaneously turned up. You're right, though, to remind me and use this medium to remind police officers and everybody else that the social distancing rules are still there. And we've got to lead by example. And it sends all the wrong sorts of messages if the impression is given there's one rule for one and one rule for the other. But it can confuse people when they see law enforcers appear to be breaking the rules. I think the police get that point, the Commissioner gets that point, and you'll be reassured by the fact there's been no repeat of the Westminster Bridge incident since that one occasion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If I could just follow that up with another question. That might be the case, but the odd thing is that there have been a number of incidents over the past month in London, which are entirely to do with the police, whereby, for example, policemen have not appeared to be socially distancing themselves, and they appear to be taking a hammer to crack a nut. So, for example, in Hyde Park on Saturday, there was a protest, a demonstration. It was an anti-lockdown one, but it doesn't really matter what it was. I mean, you don't have to agree with it or not, as the case may be. But the police went in, and frankly, looking at social media and some of the film that came out there, a couple of people were manhandled. There seemed to be an awful lot of police there, certainly not socially distancing and not wearing masks and all the rest of it. And people must look at this and think, well, what's actually going on? I mean, are we being allowed to still have our right to protest, for example?
Well, look, we've got to be careful relying upon social media to get an account of events. What I do know...
It's also in the papers, I think, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah. I mean, the Commissioner raised the issue with me, and she raised with me how difficult it was policing that protest with the concerns around public safety because of the coronavirus. And actually, I think we should pay tribute to our police who've got such a difficult job in normal circumstances, literally taking risks with their personal safety to enforce the law. These are difficult split-second decisions. And, whether it's the officers policing a protest or officers dealing with firearm incidents or officers on a pursuit, these are split-second decisions. And I want to say, I'm not criticising you, but I don't think I'm placed, sitting in the comfort of this medium, to give an armchair response to what they should have done differently. What I do know, because I spoke to the Commissioner in real time, it was a really difficult policing operation. And the police did their best. There was a proportionate response. If there are complaints made by any of the protesters, they'll be investigated independently as they should. We'll make sure that happens.
Thing is, though, Mr. Mayor, I mean, you say about armchair criticism, etc. We are meant to scrutinise. I mean, one of the things we're meant to scrutinise is things such as the response of the police. I think you would appreciate that.
No, I wasn't criticising you. I was talking about myself. I don't want to be an armchair critic. Sorry, I didn't mean to criticise you. That's your job. The checks and balances is your job.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Right. Next question from Assembly Member Desai on Met Police enforcement of coronavirus public health regulations. There's been withdrawn for written response. So we swiftly move on to question from Assembly Member Prince, which is question number 1502 on public transport capacity. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank the Assembly member for his question? In keeping with government plans for the National Rail Service, TfL is working hard to gradually return service levels to as close to 100% of services as possible. Tube services are currently running at between 85 and 90%. I think it was 92% today. Bus services up to 85%, DLR at over 80%, and TfL rail at full service. This is far higher than any train operating company around the country. This has increased from tube services around 60 to 65% during rush hour and bus services at 80% at the peak of the crisis. Again, this was way higher than services around the country. We've restored the Circle line and reopened 7 of the 37 stations that were previously closed. Some stations will remain closed temporarily so that staff can be redeployed to help manage busier stations, and some stations with lift-only access will remain closed because social distancing is simply not possible. The main reason we were previously not able to run more services was due to a significant number of TfL staff that were shielding, sick, or self-isolating. At the peak of the crisis, nearly a third of train operators on London Underground were off work. I want to thank our heroic transport staff for all they have done and continue to do to keep transport running in London for essential workers. We lobbied the government to enable TfL staff to access the key worker testing scheme, which they weren't able to do for a long time, and actively encouraging eligible staff to do so to help ensure they can come back to work if they're well enough. However, with social distancing requirements still in place, we will simply not be able to return to carrying the numbers of people who use the public transport network before the crisis. As I've previously set out, people should only travel when absolutely necessary. Those who can work from home must continue to do so, and we'll have to spend more leisure time in our local area. Many more people have to walk and cycle, and we urgently we're working hard urgently to enable this to happen.
Assembly Member Prince. We'll come back. Assembly Member Prince, we can't hear you. You're still there?
Hello, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I can hear, Chair. I can hear Keith.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Right,
Eid Mubarak to you, Mr. Mayor, and your family, and
Thank you,
to
Keith.
all Londoners. Mr. Mayor, it would be helpful if you could give us a target date, if you're able to, on when you think services will return to 100%.
Yeah, good question. So TfL are part of what's called the government's rail delivery group, and we've been working for some weeks with DfT, again, collegially and collaboratively. The first phase was to return to 70% by 18th of May. And we managed to exceed that, and I was able to give you the really good news about we're about 90+% on tubes, rush hour, 85% buses, 100% TfL rail. Our rail delivery group are asking the TOCs to get to 100% in early June. Because of the large number of our staff who are shielding, we can't say it will happen by 1st of June. I think more realistic is middle of June, for the simple reason, because of the age profile of our staff, some of them are older and have underlying health conditions. So I can't say definitively a date, but we're working to go as soon as possible. The sooner the better. I think more realistic, just to manage your expectations, is middle of June, but it could happen sooner if we get people back swifter from shielding, self-isolation or sickness.
So maybe back before the Premier League then, Mr. Mayor. So
well, there's not an announcement yet, is there? I'm not sure. Maybe I missed that.
Mid-June. On the matter or the issue of capacity, I think it was the Minister, Rachel Maclean, Transport Minister, who recognised the advantages of social distancing of using motorcycles. Also, clearly, riding a motorcycle is safer, I would argue, in relation to not getting or exposing yourself to the virus than maybe the tube, the trains and the buses. You've said already, Mr. Mayor, that we will not be able to carry the number of people that we already do in relation to our public transport system. So would you agree that motorcycling would be one of the options? Clearly, we would prefer people to walk and cycle, but I don't think that's a real option for people who live further out in places like my areas of Havering and Redbridge. But motorcycling, I think there was someone who said, you might know who it was, motorcycles generate far less pollution, save time and money for the rider, and don't create congestion. I don't know if you know who said that, Mr. Mayor.
There's a wise owl.
You were, of course, yourself.
So, can you raise a good point? So, sorry.
Yeah, so if I could just finish then, Mr. Mayor. The ask is really at this moment in time, because of the importance that motorcycles play in getting people around without the risk of getting infected, because of the importance that motorcycles play in keeping London running, you will know that many people who are in lockdown have been relying on the motorcycle deliveries for their food, for their prescriptions and so on. Would you at this time, Mr. Mayor, please exclude motorcycles of any age from the ULEZ charge so that we can get the maximum use of motorcycles at this very important time?
Well, look, firstly, thank you for raising this issue. It's an important issue. So you'll be aware that that motorbikes are exempt from the congestion charge. Now, the reason why they're not exempt from the ultra-low emission zone is because that tackles air quality issues, and we're keen to keep on top of the air quality issues. And so I'm afraid we aren't going to be making motorcycles exempt from the ULEZ, although they'll continue to be exempt from the congestion charge. What we've not done is to, when the government asks us to widen the scope of the congestion charge, when the government asks us to change the levels of the congestion charge, what we're not doing is bringing motorbikes into the congestion charge. We could have done that, and that would have made the government very happy because it raised more money. We've not done that. And so it's really important to put that on record. And so I'm more than happy for you to meet with the TfL team to explain some of our thinking around this. But can I just say this? I know you're very well respected in this community. We have seen a large number of increase of collisions in the last few weeks with motorcyclists, and any influence that you've got, just pass on the importance of riding safely, because I'm worried about the increase in fatalities and collisions. It's about 30% of collisions have been motorcyclists. That's far higher than it is during the non-pandemic phase.
Okay, Mr. Mayor. So I would like to take you up on the offer of a meeting. Would we be able to have them? I've got some experts who'd want to meet with you. Is it possible we could meet with you?
Absolutely. So, Chair, why don't we agree this? Why don't I agree for the TfL team to meet up with Keith and his experts as soon as possible, because he wants to be quickly, and we'll do it as soon as possible to make that happen.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on, Mr. Mayor, if I can move on. Again, this is around capacity. Taxis. If I could just read to you some of the messages that I'm getting from taxi drivers, Mr. Mayor. It's from Steve Kay, who's in one of my constituencies. I'm deeply concerned regarding the latest announcements from the Mayor's office looking at the possibility of excluding diesel taxis from a number of major streets in the city. Given that less than 30% of the industry is zero emission capable, and because of the current situation pertaining to COVID-19, it is unlikely that purchasing a zero emission capable ZEC vehicle would be financially viable given the current work levels. The same issues would also apply to renting a ZEC. But he goes on to say that he thinks many drivers will go out of work. Another resident, Gary Kay, the latest news is a huge worry for myself and other black cab drivers, even though we have one of the only vehicles in London where social distancing can truly be practiced and is fully wheelchair accessible. We have also been badly affected due to COVID-19, and our work levels at present time are almost non-existent. And then finally, from Stephanie, another resident, I'm a 31-year-old single mother who spent a long time and effort passing the knowledge of London to enable myself to have flexible hours to look after my one-year-old son. The new proposals which are under review will completely destroy my living, i.e. the closure of Waterloo and London Bridge to all vehicles except buses and cycles. Mr. Mayor, at this time when social distancing is imperative for people's safety, London taxis have a built-in partition that keep the drivers safe and passengers safe. Only London taxis can drop people with mobility impairment outside where they need to go. Even buses can't do that, Mr. Mayor. So can you at this time, at least until this issue is over, making sure that taxis can go where buses go, Mr. Mayor?
Well, firstly, I will make sure that the comments from the taxi drivers are passed on to TfL. That forms part of the engagement we need to have before the changes are made. Secondly, I've already said in outline to a previous question that we're planning to allow zero-emission capable taxis to have access to those streets where only walkers, cyclists and buses are allowed. It is not our plan at the moment to allow heavily polluting diesel taxis to access those streets. But if there are other comments from other taxi drivers, can I please ask you to let TfL have them? Because we are keen to hear directly from those who have got views on the widening of the scope and level of charges that we're being required to do by the government.
Okay, because of the time, I'm going to have to leave it there, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Right, Mr. Mayor, next question is on TfL finances. Question number 1539, which is from Assembly Member Danish.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the question. Last week at the 11th hour, and after 7 weeks of discussions, the government finally agreed a funding package to allow TfL to run public transport safely in London for the next 4.5 months. I want to be honest and upfront with Londoners, this is not a good deal for London, but it was the only deal the government would agree to, and I had no choice but to accept it to keep the tubes and buses running. We had to seek government help, as every other transport provider in the UK has already done, because COVID-19 has had a catastrophic impact on TfL's finances. We rely heavily on passenger fares to pay for the services we run. Fares income has fallen by 90% in the last 2 months because Londoners have done the right thing and stayed at home. TfL has put 7,000 staff on the government's furlough scheme, a quarter of its workforce, and is topping up.
Hi, Mr. Mayor. Could I stop you there? Because obviously I'm running out of time, and I'd like to. You're saying what you've said before with respect. 2 points. Firstly, a fact check from this morning, please, Mr. Mayor. On Good Morning Britain, the TV show, you confirmed that it was you and not the government that made you do the congestion charge. So you told the Assembly it was the government, and you told Breakfast TV that it was you. So which is it, Mr. Mayor?
Well, I can read you what the government made me do. Will that help you?
Well, I've got the clip in front of me from you actually said on GMTV TV, Mr. Mayor. So I think we'll let Londoners decide. Please publish the advice, the bailout notice as soon as possible.
I want to publish it.
Can I move on to a second?
Boris Johnson.
Can I move on to a second point? Because I am running out of time. Can you confirm there'll be no further slippage on Crossrail's most recent projected opening date of summer 2021 to summer 22, please?
No, I can't. So Crossrail are looking into the implications of COVID-19 on both timescales and finances. What I'm happy to do, because I know this is a huge interest to the Assembly, is to, once we've got an answer from the Crossrail Chair and Chief Executive, to write to all Assembly members so they're cognizant of where we are. And of course, also I'll be making public, unlike the Secretary for Transport, what the advice from Crossrail is in relation to that issue.
Thank you. Just coming back to congestion charge, if it wasn't you that caused it, Mr. Mayor, will you join with me and faith groups and businesses and campaign to stop the extension of the congestion charge over weekends? Will you campaign with me if you're against it?
It's easier than that. It's easier than that. All you have to do is say to Boris Johnson and Grant Shapps, no, the Mayor can't widen the scope or increase the charges.
You're the Mayor of London, Mr. Mayor. You have that power. You haven't got to go to the government. You're the Mayor.
Well, here's
what decide that.
I mean, Chair, I've got to be able to respond. The response is this. Because of the same situation other bodies across the country are facing, acute financial challenges because the fares box has dried up, the government's got to support us like they're supporting others. Everyone else has got a grant, no need for a loan, no strings attached. The government has chosen to give us a grant, plus required us to take out a loan, plus attach these strings. You can very easily say to Grant Shapps, Boris Johnson, don't attach these strings. Don't require the Mayor to immediately reinstate the C charge. Don't require the Mayor to widen the scope and level of charges of C charge. If I was to say no to the government, I couldn't receive the grant. Should mean that TfL wouldn't provide the buses and services we do. It's as simple as that.
On public consultation, you appreciate public consultation for these kind of things is hugely important. What public consultation are you going to do to make sure that church groups and business groups and disabled people can rightly have their say about this? Because this is the thing I'm having more in my postbag than any other issue in the last 4 years.
The really important thing for all groups is to raise with Boris Johnson and Grant Shapps their concern over the next week, please, because these are due to come in pretty early, as the government told us to do. They're due to come in on the 22nd of June. But the more people that lobby the Prime Minister, lobby the Secretary of State to say to us they will still give us the grant and the support that we need without the need to do this, the better.
I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Duval, you have indicated you want to come in.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, can you look, a sensible way forward seems to me that we've got to get into a reinstatement of the grant regime from central government that was taken away under Boris Johnson, in fact given away by Boris Johnson, if I can recall it rightly. Can you just remind Assembly members what we've lost over the last 4 years? And obviously, I think the reinstatement of any grant would have to be considerably more. And can we nail the myth that's going around on social media? It's really the big lie, the lie that your fares freeze has brought TfL's finances to its knees, and actually the cost of that fare freeze is a lot less than the loss of the government grant that was taken away from us.
Thank you for your question. I think what people need to be aware of is it was the editor of the Evening Standard and the Prime Minister of our country who reached an agreement in 2015 to remove from London our operating grant, which is about an average of £1 billion a year we receive. What that means is we're one of the only transport authorities in the Western world not to receive an operating grant from central government. Now, notwithstanding the fact that I inherited that deal, plus a £1.5 billion deficit, we've managed to, because of the changes I've brought in, reduce our operating deficit by more than 71%. So it's gone from £1.5 billion to £200 million. Those efficiencies have helped pay for my fares freeze, where the average London household is saving £200 a year when they'd had seen 42% increases over the previous 8 years. But also, I managed to increase our cash balances by 16%, which meant before the virus began, they're at £2.2 billion. The reality is this, though, because 80% of our services are paid for by fares, by congestion charge, and by advertising, all of which dried up. We lost more than 90%. We had to use our reserves to pay for our services each month, which cost £600 million. So the £2.2 billion surplus I had, 16% higher than before, has been used month on month. So we're now down to the minimum we're allowed to hold, which is 2 months' worth of money, which is the money we need to provide the services for the next 2 months. So the choice I had last Thursday, when we reached the end of the 2 months, when we reached the beginning of that period, was to serve a section 114 notice, which would have meant me having to cut services on the tubes, on the buses, on the tram, on the overground, at a time we need to be increasing them, or to accept this bad deal from the government. And the government's just put a sticking plaster over this, because in 4.5 months' time, this money will run out. And they've got a choice to restore the operating grant, to devolve us the powers to run our city and to make us no longer the most centralised democracy in the Western world, or a combination of the both. And by the way, Boris Johnson, when he was mayor, commissioned the London Finance Commission, who recommended a devolution of the sort of property taxes around stamp duty, around business rates, around council tax, around land value capture, the sort of receipts we could use to provide a public transport service in the absence of an operating grant from government.
Thank you.
Does Assembly Member Moore wish to come in? She said she may want to. I take that as no.
I think in light of the time, Mr. Mayor, Chair, I think I will leave it. I think Member Duval has said everything that needs saying.
Thank you very much. Next question is on safeguarding vulnerable children. That's from Assembly Member Arnold. Question number 1553, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. It's incredibly concerning that low numbers of vulnerable children are attending school. There have early signs of a positive shift as boroughs are beginning to see more children in school every day. National figures from the 14th of May showed 14% of vulnerable children attended, an increase from under 5% in March. Although I don't have statutory responsibility for school-aged children, I want to reassure the Assembly that my Deputy Mayor for Education and Childcare is in regular contact with Directors of Children's Services through the Association of London Directors of Children's Services. London's local authorities are working closely with schools and their local borough commands. For example, I know Islington is following up daily on the attendance at school or nursery of over 80 children identified as being at highest risk and who will be safer in school. The executive of the London Safeguarding Children's Partnership met recently to coordinate resilience and multi-agency work during and after lockdown. This body brings together representatives from the Association of London's Directors of Children's Services, London Councils, the MPS, MOPAC and NHS England. The Director of My Violence Reduction Unit, LIPEC, attends the National Safeguarding and Young People's Board, and the VAU is working with their partners to ensure that vulnerable young people and families get the support they need. Partners are preparing for a rise in child protection referrals and demand for mental health support once children do return to school, so the government must provide sufficient resources to meet this demand.
Right. Before I bring in Assembly Member Arnold, do you want to come in? Assembly Member Arnold, are you there?
Yes, I am here. I am here.
Do you
Can
want
I
to
come in, please?
Yes, please. It's your.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for that response to my question. And can I just start by saying Ramadan Mubarak to you and your family, and to all at this time of Ramadan. I totally understand what you said, but can I just say to you, you may not have the responsibility, but the GLA gives you a duty to be mindful of the needs of all Londoners. And so that's why I'm bringing this to you. Our vulnerable children deserve as much of your time as anybody else, if I can be so bold to say that. And what we do know is that it's startling. And what we also know is that during this time of the coronavirus, the widening gap within our city between those who live the good life and those especially vulnerable young children whose lives are blighted by their exposure to the toxic trio. If people don't know what they are, they should look them up. That everything is highlighted and has become more critical for them. I did a virtual visit to one of my great charities this week, and heard from Samira Mer, the founder of the Interfaith charity. I think you've met her, Plate for You. And she just brought it home to me, and in that, if it wasn't for charities like her, thousands of vulnerable children would not be fed each day. The cupboards in their homes are bare. So will you, I'm sure you will agree with me that that is shameful, that is a reality in our city, the fifth richest city in the world, and that you have got to do everything that you can to work nationally, locally, so that all policies that are made are mindful of this. And that then requires every policy to undertake an equality impact assessment. Because if the policies are made on this basis, then the needs of these young people and those others who are disadvantaged within our city would be at the foremost of the cases that are being put. Would you agree with me?
Absolutely, Chair. I'm not sure there's a word that the Slimmer has said that I wouldn't agree with, including being aware of the fact that even though I may not have statutory responsibilities, I've got a moral responsibility, but also as the leader of the city, to look to the future. And particularly providing the helping hand for the most vulnerable. That's how you judge a society, how you help the most vulnerable. And so as it was a point well made. Just to reassure you, I've actually this week written to the Secretary of State for Education, imploring upon him to ensure that those children who receive free school meals and vouchers continue to do so during the half term coming up, and also the summer holidays. We were successful lobbying him for the Easter holidays, and I'm hopeful we can lobby him for the half term and summer holidays too. You mentioned food poverty that many of our children experience, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Members, in order to allow the remaining business of the agenda to be completed, can the members agree to suspend Standing Order 2.9b in accordance with the provisions of Standing Order 1.1h? Can we agree?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Moving on to the next question then, is question number 1518 on COVID-19, domestic abuse from Assembly Member O'Connell. Very, very little time is left, under 1 minute. Mr. Mayor.
Chair, why don't I ask Steve to ask his question rather than taking up his time by giving my answer. I can send him I'll send him the answer in writing, but he can ask his question.
Yeah.
Are you content with that?
It's good to see you, and I'm glad, and I hope your family are well. There isn't enough time. There's two emerging real issues post-lockdown, which will be domestic violence, domestic abuse, and also drugs and gangs, which we'll pursue later through P&C. All I would urge you is that with domestic violence, although the figures you quoted, there's an increase, I think is a hidden increase, and I think probably post-lockdown it will be an even bigger issue than before, and I hope that you, the councils, the government and the Met will give it the priority they absolutely needs and deserves, Mr Mayor.
Chair, I agree with everything that's been said, and we will. And can I just reassure the Assembly member that not only the Commissioner, but the Deputy Mayor, but also the Victims Commissioner are on top of this. We're speaking to groups across the city, and you're absolutely right. These figures are hiding away what's really going on, and we are really worried about what's below the surface. And also the point about these concerns around gang violence and youth violence as well, we're worried about. And in answer to the previous question, I mentioned some of the violence suppression work we're doing. But any ideas, any things we should be doing or not, please always feel free to feel that you can contact us about ideas you've got. We're always happy to listen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Next item is a question from Assembly Member Ashlomi MP. The question is supporting small businesses. Question number 1580, Mr. Mayor.
Can I thank the member for this question? London's businesses are the engine of our economy, and while I welcome the packages of support from government for businesses and the self-employed, including the recent extensions of the scheme, I'm still concerned about the accessibility of funds for London businesses, the possible gaps in support for micro businesses and thousands of self-employed Londoners. I'm also clear that the economic impact of the outbreak and the restrictions brought in to tackle it will be far-reaching and long-lasting. Since the start of the pandemic, I've been determined to do what I can to support the economy. That's why we have launched the Pay It Forward London scheme, through which over 2,740 members of the public have already contributed over £160,000 to support 147 local businesses through the crisis, added extra capacity to the London Growth Hub. Already over 700 businesses have benefited from the one-to-one advisory sessions since the crisis began, given 100% rent relief for 3 months to SMEs on Transport for London's estates, and committed to invest a further £1 million in additional business support activity through the London Growth Hub over the next 12 months, including help to adapt and diversify an SME's business model or adopt new technologies to trade more effectively online. We've also launched a £2.3 million Culture at Risk Business Support Fund to help multiple venues and artists across the capital. These industries are so important to the fabric of our city and play a key role in helping us to recover. And my team are urgently looking at funding options for those businesses that fall between the cracks of the government support measures, and I've written to the Chancellor and the Business Secretary to highlight the gaps in their measures that are leaving thousands of London businesses without access to support.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good afternoon to you, and Ramadan Mubarak to you and your family. Thank you for that reply. And I think what we've seen is that there has been that government support, but like you rightly said, a number of businesses have fallen through the cracks and they don't qualify for anything. We have really good sectors across my constituency and in London of tourism, hospitality and the nighttime economy, which is seeing that lockdown in place for much longer. Will you urge the government at looking at continuing that business support for as long as they can? And if it means introducing a sectorial approach and a job retention scheme, for example, is there much more we can be doing to help those businesses?
Absolutely. Can I say, Chair, the Assembly is absolutely right about this sectoral approach response. But there are some sectors that actually can come out of lockdown quicker, construction being a good example, agriculture being a good example. There are others that simply can't. Hospitality, culture, creative industries, and some are retail. And the government's got to realise we don't want to inadvertently be giving people an incentive to get back out there to allow the virus to spread prematurely because they're worried about their business going bust. And we've got to lobby the government to do some more. I was pleased by the announcement yesterday from the Secretary of State from DCMS, Oliver Dowden, about a group he set up, a task force to look at culture and creative industries. And we need support from the government because one of the jewels in our crown is our culture and creative industries. 1 out of 6 jobs in this area, but they're vulnerable. And many of them, businesses will go bust and they won't be able to come back. And so we need to give them the support, a helping hand, rather than a handout is the way I see it.
Right, and just finally, Mr. Mayor, is there more that you could be doing in promoting that London cultural heartbeat? Obviously, I've got an interest in terms of the South Bank in my constituency, but there's a potential collapse of the theatre and culture industry where they're unique because they need 65% capacity to break even. And even with the conditions imposed, they can probably only run on 15% capacity. That will not work for a number of those key organisations, which are the heartbeat of providing culture, not just to Londoners, but young Londoners, diverse Londoners. We need them up and running again.
Absolutely, and we've got to give people hope. We've got to give people hope. And you mentioned the South Banks, even the South Banks, who are big, they're struggling. But the smaller theatres, the smaller cultural venues are really struggling. So one of the things that I talked about in my answer was the £2.3 million assistance to the culture at risk at venues, the support we're giving. Justine Simons, the Deputy Mayor, is doing a huge amount of work in this area with Raj Agrawal, the Deputy Mayor for Business. But any ideas that you've got, we're really happy to be receptive of. But actually, you're on in Parliament, along with Gareth Bacon. You can be raising these issues, bearing in mind you wear a hat as members of the Assembly as well, as being members of Parliament who can lobby the government, from whom we need real support.
Thank you. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you. Next question on county lines from Assembly Member Devnish will have a written answer because Conservative group have run out of their time. Moving on to question number 1589, which is on food insecurity during COVID-19, and that's from Assembly Member McCartney. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the question. Food banks and food aid charities are doing incredible work getting food to those in need. However, they're seeing unprecedented demand and a big fall in contributions. The Trussell Trust saw an 81% increase in demand for emergency food packages in the last 2 weeks in March compared to last year. Use of independent food aid networks, London food banks, increased 68%. I've called on Londoners to donate to food banks and volunteer where they can and when it's safe, and I'm so proud that Londoners came forward to help. I've asked supermarkets to provide food aid charity with unrestricted online access to obtain food they need. And I'm also supporting the SCG Food Subgroup, overseeing setting up community hubs in every London borough, allowing the London Food Alliance to direct food supplies to frontline charities needing them. Since late March, the London Food Alliance has distributed 1,500 tonnes of food to 1,500 organisations. That's around 3.8 million meals. In addition, the first round of London Community Response Fund grants supported voluntary and community organisations to buy food and other essentials so they could keep providing vulnerable Londoners with access to food. I'll do everything I can to support their work, but demands on the emergency fund aid sector are a sign of deep underlying problems that must also be addressed.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was going to ask about whether you would write to the government regarding extending the voucher scheme for those children entitled to free school meals, but I'm very pleased you've indicated that you have already written and asked for that. But it is a scandal that children in our city are going hungry. Now, your office with London boroughs and community organisations have really stepped up and supported those food banks and other networks. But what further support is needed to ensure they can offer the support that's needed for the short, but also the medium and longer term?
Thanks for the question and all that you do in this area. But one of the big issues is those receiving benefits, the delay in getting them. For those who applied for universal credit, the government could give cash payments now, not a loan, cash payments now. A big issue is those who have no recourse to public funds, who we know are struggling. Some of the families that Jeanette referred to are families who've got no recourse to public funds who are literally going hungry. The government could change the rules now during this period to allow them to have recourse to welfare benefits and other support they need as well. Other things the government could do is to change the local housing allowance in relation to some of the concerns renters have who are renting as well. But we know a lot of the voluntary and community sector that usually fundraise the London Marathon and other things to pay for services they've not been able to do. And so the government really has got to step up and help. They're losing billions of pounds because of the inability to congregate and raise funds via jumble sales, fairs, marathons. And so if we allow them to go under, it's a big problem. But also, they need their staff. They can't be furloughing their staff. So the furlough scheme needs to be adapted to help them as well. So look, it's really important the government speeds up the announcement of the £750 million so it gets to the coalface as soon as possible.
Thank you. Now, a coalition of charities, including the Child Poverty Action Group, the Children's Society and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, have called for a temporary coronavirus emergency income support scheme because they, like you, recognise that many people actually do not have savings and are at great risk of defaulting on rent and mortgage payments. Will you support that request and make that request to government?
I'm happy to look at the details, but it sounds like a no-brainer to me. Let me look into that and then publicly show my support for that.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Whittle, you have next question. Got little time left. Are you content to have a written response, or you want Mr. Mayor to answer your question on post-COVID-19 street patrolling?
Yes, a written response will be fine, Mr. Chairman. Otherwise it's going to be pointless.
All right, thank you very much for that. We move on to the next question, which is from Assembly Member Dismore, and that's about exercise sickness. Question number 1573, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank this gentleman for this important question? The Gillet family played a full part in the London element of exercise Cygnus, which was comprised of 2 tabletop scenario exercises in 2016. Officers from the MPS, LFB, TfL and London Resilience Group participated. Over 2 days, 24 actions for London's pan-flu preparedness were identified and subsequently incorporated into London's pandemic influenza, pan-flu, and excess deaths frameworks. London Resilience Forum fed its findings back into government. In 2017, the Exercise Cygnus National Report was published, which identified 22 lessons in total aimed at resilience forums, NHS England, PHE, the Department for Health and other government departments. I agree the national lessons should be made public, and I'm happy for the lessons from the London exercise to be shared and for one of my officers to brief you on their implementation. However, it's important to understand what emergency planners tell me. The incident never respects the plan. The response to an influenza pandemic has a focus on treatment through antiviral drugs and other medicines. Those options clearly not available in response to COVID-19. The specifics of the response have also changed as the scientific understanding of the disease has improved and as the legislation and government advice has changed as well.
Well, thank you for that answer, Mr. Mayor. Would you agree that Exercise Cygnus revealed a whole host of shortcomings with the government's response, which were not acted on? For example, it found that residential care homes were noted as sites of high risk for virus spread and lethality, and that the impact on care homes would be catastrophic unless new measures were put in place. However, no specific guidance for care homes was included in the government strategy. So untested patients, including those previously suffering from the virus, were bussed from hospitals to care homes without information about the patient being passed on or the provision of the PPE needed. And unbelievably, untested agency workers, often on 0 hours contracts, moved freely within and between different care homes to cover for other staff who were self-isolating. It's the case, isn't it, that highly vulnerable people and staff were exposed to infection, and indeed many died as a result of the government's failings?
Absolutely, it's a scandal. It's a scandal. And what's clear is how ill-prepared the government appeared to have been, even though we knew the virus was coming and we knew we had weeks to prepare in advance of other countries had no time to prepare. One of the reasons why I'm keen for there to be an independent public inquiry is to find out what happened, to learn the lessons, to make sure we, before the next pandemic, and it's clear there's going to be other pandemics, those lessons are learned. It's crucial to do so. When you just think about the circumstances in which people died absent from their loved ones because they couldn't access them, it's even more heartbreaking.
Exactly. And London's pandemic response strategy was reliant on PPE stocks held by the government. But 45% of the boxes of PPE held in the national government stockpile were out of date when the pandemic hit, according to Channel 4 revelations. This includes nearly 80% of the stock of respirators. What's the point of local resilience work if the national government is so slapdash in allowing failings like this?
Quite. I mean, the SCG has been doing amazing work and the Resilience Forum has been doing amazing work. But the problem is they're having to, metaphorically firefight without the equipment. And it's been a challenge. And the way a response works is trust and confidence. You trust that the national government's put in place the equipment you need to deal with the pandemic. So the new personnel who are there, because personnel change all the time, have confidence in the equipment they are promised. And these are one of the lessons that must be learned. This is you doing an amazing job trying to coordinate some of the assistance that care homes need, but it's been really, really hard.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Right. If we move on to next question, which is from Assembly Member Gavron. Question number 1583 on global cities' response to coronavirus. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Senator McGavran for her question. Throughout this crisis, I've been in touch with other mayors around the world to offer my solidarity, to share ideas and to discuss best practice, including the C40 group of global cities. What's clear for all of us is that COVID-19 has exposed the inequalities which fail people from deprived communities more than anyone else. We must come out of this embracing a new normal and with a renewed drive to address the climate emergency. The conversations I've had with other C40 mayors has shown that there is a united ambition to ensure that any recovery in cities not only addresses inequalities and drives economic activity, but also delivers ambitious climate action to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. I've already endorsed, alongside 40 other mayors, the C40 principles for a green recovery, and I look forward to seeing how this can inform the work we will do in London. To ensure other cities can learn from our work to build a greener and cleaner city here in London, we've been sharing information about some of our key initiatives, such as the launch of my new street space plan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I first want to just thank you for your unwavering leadership during this crisis on so many fronts. And I know your leadership of C40 as Vice Chair is widely recognised, and your leadership with other cities. Now, all over the world now, cities are making unparalleled changes. The most obvious one is to the streetscape, where I think London is now a world leader. These changes could have long-term benefits, mental health and physical benefits for citizens and to the quality of life of our city and many, many other cities. Do you think there's an appetite for national governments, local governments, working with city leaders to, and of course here at home, across the world and here at home, to make sure that these changes are not just for the pandemic, but enduring and forever?
I think this is such an important question. So we've heard over the last 3 hours, Caroline Pigeon, Caroline Russell, Sean Berry, and many of us in favour of some of the things we're doing, a cross-party coalition of the willing, trying to use this awful, awful virus as an opportunity to change our landscape, street scene, encourage walking and cycling, make it easier and safer. But this coalition's got to stay together, because there are some people who are in favour of a car-led recovery. There are some people who want us to minimise the transformation we want to do, and so we need to work together to do so. The good news is, I'm not breaching confidences, but the conversations I've had with the Prime Minister, I think he gets this. Look, he's somebody who enjoys cycling. He believes in active travel. My concern is that politics, capital P, gets in the way of this stuff. I mean, the briefing against me from DfT and Number 10 was outrageous after the deal was done, which makes it difficult to work collegially with national government to do this good. This is good for all of us. And so what I say to those tribal politicians, some of whom are on this virtual meeting, some of whom are in Number 10, those special advisors and others, is just stop it. Stop it to allow us to work with national government, with assembly members, cross-party, to transform our city so it's greener, more sustainable, better and permanent.
Yes, okay, well, I think the Assembly will do all it can to help you on that. I just also wanted to ask you about something else, which is that many other cities across the world have more powers, more resources, and significantly more devolved authority than you have. And even now, TfL is undermining yours, and not TfL, what am I talking about? Government is undermining yours and taking over, to a certain extent, TfL. I would like to know, other cities, I think, will be able to be more flexible and agile because they have these powers. What increased powers would help you to help Londoners to get back to work, to find jobs, and to make the London economic recovery a climate recovery?
But when I speak to mayors across Europe, not just France and Spain and Italy and Germany, and across North America or South America or the Far East, I'm jealous of the powers the mayors have compared to the powers that I've got. We're the most centralised democracy in the Western world. And what compounds my grievance with the government is rather than them walking the walk in relation to devolving more powers to us, they use the opportunity of the financial pressures of TfL to take powers away from us. The power to decide what the fares are going to be, the powers to decide what happens with the congestion charge, the powers about what happens with under 18 school buses, the power about what happens to over 60s and on. And so, look, it's really important the government realises that we need more powers, not less, more resources, not less, powers over issues in relation to housing, powers in relation to what happens in the business community, powers in relation to property taxes, powers in relation to land value capture, powers in relation to making sure we've got the powers and resources to have a transition to a carbon-free city. You'll be aware I've expressed my frustration on previous occasions. I want to go zero carbon by 2030, but I've only got powers over less than half of the things I need to get to zero carbon. The other half is contingent upon the government doing those things, and that's why it's really important. If we're going to have a green recovery and it's meaningful, the government's got to devolve us much more than they currently have, and also not revert to type, which is taking stuff away when things get uncomfortable.
Thank you. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Right. Next question is from Assembly Member Cooper. That's on ensuring clean air and space for people during lockdown. Question 1559.
Thank you. Before the COVID-19 crisis, our air quality programme, including the introduction of the ULEZ, had already contributed to a reduction of 44% in roadside nitrogen dioxide in central London between February 2017 and January 2020, 44% reduction. As we move from the COVID response to recovery, our challenge will be to ensure we do not lose the gains we've made. We continue our aim to eradicate air pollution permanently, as well as tackle the climate emergency. Last week, with Will Norman and Heidi Alexander, I launched my London Street Space programme, which, working with London boroughs, aims to fast-track the transformation of streets across our city and avoid a car-based recovery. Wider footpaths, pedestrianisation of streets, and the relocation of road space for cycleways are necessary to make it easy as possible for social distancing. The Street Space programme is a good first step, but I also need the support of the UK government to continue to clean up our air. With emerging evidence that air pollution can increase vulnerability to the most severe impacts of COVID-19, WHO recommended limits must now be enshrined in law. As part of this, here in London, I want to expand school streets to enable more children to walk or cycle to school. I'm keen to see an accelerated removal of the most polluting vehicles from our road through the scrappage schemes and the ultra-low emission zone expansion.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Mayor. I mean, I think obviously you were ahead of COVID, because if you look at the figures for the reduction in pollutants in London's air from the 8th of April, when the ULEZ launched in the centre of London last year, up until the 23rd of March when we locked down, the improvement was 35%, and it's been a further 23% since then. But obviously not everybody is able to use, we'll all get this point made very regularly to us as Assembly members. Not everyone can cycle, not everyone can walk. So your transport strategy has always said that 20% of journeys, may be made by use of other vehicles. But what we really need, and I hope you would agree with me on this, is real support now from the government in terms of getting everybody to move away from petrol and diesel vehicles. And instead of talking about phasing out their sale by 2035, shouldn't that be brought forward? And shouldn't we be moving for that minority of journeys that have to be made on a motorised basis, not on foot, by bicycle, or indeed on public transport? Don't we need that change to come in earlier?
Absolutely, and you'll be aware that I'm in favour of that transition to be phasing out of cells by 2030. The government's talking about 2045, maybe 2040, maybe 2035. That's still too far away. And I think, actually, as I said to you, this virus is awful. Really, it's awful. But there are some silver linings, and this may be one of them. And our job is to lobby the government to play its part in this important task.
Absolutely, and we know that you've been going into bat on that for us, and also leading the way. And I think we've already talked about street space, and I think a number of us are very excited by that. But again, one of the things that would enhance street space and help some of those people who, perhaps can't, ride a bicycle, and we do want to see an increase in cycling. But what about grants for e-bikes, which makes cycling so much more accessible for older Londoners and Londoners, you know, who just haven't got the puff to do that? Some London boroughs already offer loans and grants for bikes. Can you work with them to extend that, maybe via TfL, but also to press the government to support this?
Yeah, I mean, we persuaded the government, not me, but others as well, when the advent of the first grants for electric vehicles. I think similarly, bearing in mind how expensive some of the e-bikes are, but they're brilliant. They can be transformative to somebody who, you know, just gives that bit of assistance that they need. And the technology is moving so fast now, and they're very easy. They're very adaptable and stuff. And so, you know, congratulations to those boroughs who are currently giving the grants for the e-bikes. And I'm more than happy, and I'll get Heidi and Will to speak to you about what we can do, putting our heads together in relation to lobbying the government for some more assistance in relation to grants for e-bikes.
That would be really welcome, Mr. Mayor. And you have talked about the boroughs just there on e-bikes, but also in relation to street space. And it's been quite a frustration for me and a number of other Assembly members where we see my constituency, Merton, you know, they've come forward with a very exciting plan. They brought it forward very quickly. They're doing emergency traffic orders, making that space for the social distancing and extra space for cycling. Unfortunately, Wandsworth has been dragged kicking and screaming and finally released something on Friday. What more can we do to get those boroughs who are not coming forward quickly enough to aid cycling, to help people actively travel, to keep those social distances as we come out of lockdown?
You know, I think the public's ahead of politicians. You know, I think the public get it. And we've got to use people power. I say as a Tooting boy, you know, significance of people power. We've got to use people power. All of us are adept at persuading members of the public to change their views or persuade them to subscribe to our points of view. We've got to use this awful virus as an opportunity to persuade people that this is the right thing to do, and for them to put pressure on their councils. And that people power will motivate councils to do the right thing if they don't do it altruistically, and for the reason that we know it's important to do so. But they don't want to be one of the left behind councils. I mean, I'm really disappointed that the likes of Westminster and KNC still don't get it. I didn't realise Wandsworth were also part of that cabal. But we need to make sure...
Sadly, yes.
Because they're in charge of 95% of our roads, that they join the club. And that club is a progressive, green, sustainable, forward-looking club.
Well, Mr. Mayor, you mentioned green, and you've done a lot of work on urban greening, which has been helping Londoners to access green space during this lockdown, and I think it's become so valuable. What other options are there for providing local green space, such as creating pocket parks and opening up some of the private squares in London? Is there anything more that we can do to make those spaces available? Lots of people mention golf courses. I'm not sure how easy it is to persuade golf courses to open, but we do have a lot of space. We have a lot of private sports clubs, you know, with grounds. What more can we do to get those open? Is it just that coalition of the willing and getting the public to put that pressure on?
Well, look, I mean, you mentioned some of the help we're given. The Greener City Fund is delivering a number of green projects. The Streets Place programme will help, but I think there is change out there. The altruism of some clubs, sports clubs, and golf courses who opened their doors in the last few weeks has been really refreshing, and there's no reason why that can't carry forward. I'm particularly concerned about those people who, for understandable reasons, haven't got private amenity space and so need access to public amenity space. And one of the reasons why I've been so keen to have the charter around public realm is those pieces of land that are now owned in private hands, for them to understand the responsibility they've got to the public to make them accessible to the rest of us, particularly those without access to private amenity space. So again, we're doing exciting stuff with the charter we've talked about in relation to public squares and public realm. But any other ideas you've got, we're more than happy to listen to. One of the things that we did was to make sure, for example, when it comes to tall buildings and viewing galleries, that they're open to the public. So those amenity spaces are open to all of us, and walkways by the river and the like. We've got to make sure we use planning, we use the tools we've got to maximise the amount of public amenity space we can.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I suspect this may be the end of my question and possibly the last question of today. So also would like to wish Eid Mubarak to you and to the family. And thank you very much for answering my questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you. I do have a last question on the agenda paper, but I believe that will be dealt with in a written manner, and that is question from Assembly Member Duval on COVID-19 recovery response. Well, that brings us to an end to the question and answer session with the Mayor. Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for your answers. And may I also apologize to everyone for the interruption we had in the earlier part of the meeting due to the broadcasting issues we've had. But again, thank you everyone for your cooperation. Moving on to part B, can I ask the Assembly to agree the motion which is set out on the agenda in my name, which is that the Assembly notes the answers we had to the questions asked to the Mayor?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Date of the next meeting. The meeting scheduled for the London Assembly will be the Mayor's Question Time meeting, which will take place as a virtual meeting like today at 10 a.m. on Thursday, 18th of June, 2020. There is no urgent business required for consideration, so on that basis, I declare this meeting closed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Well done. Your first meeting.
GLA Chamber Sound.